The year is 1994 and a change was approaching. Sony had launched the PlayStation and with it came a whole wave of innovation. For one, Sony's engineering team was committed to the CD-ROM format. The cartridge format that was used by Nintendo and Sega for many years prior was not even considered to be an option. CD-ROMs allowed for cheaper and more streamlined development. A development build could be burnt onto a CD and played on a test kit without too much trouble. Much easier than the old cartridge format. According to Sony president Jim Ryan, compact discs gave people the appetite to take more risks. While certainly not the first CD-ROM based system, with the launch of the Sony PlayStation, it introduced CD-ROMs to many gamers. Before the PlayStation, many of us were using cartridges or floppy disks. Sony took full advantage of the CD-ROM format and marketed the PlayStation to a different audience than Nintendo or Sega. Over in the USA, extreme sports, racing and fighting games were very popular early on that contained licensed punk rock, metal, rap and R&B soundtracks on the disc. In the UK, Sony targeted the system to the 20-something-year-old with disposable income. The underground club scene and the PlayStation went hand in hand, with Sony setting up dedicated PlayStation areas in over 50 UK underground clubs. This wasn't just video games anymore. The popular game Wipeout by Psygnosis would feature songs by the Chemical Brothers that were very popular in the clubs at the time. The CD-ROM was integral to the success of the PlayStation 1. Over on the Nintendo 64, many wondered why Nintendo stuck with the cartridge format. The PlayStation was the system that had the larger games, the 100-hour plus RPGs, long cutscenes, full-motion video sequences, and amazing music soundtracks. Everything was just bigger and better. But as they say, every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and as a result of the successful CD-ROM format came piracy. Sony knew that crackers would be snooping around the internals of the system and trying to find ways to pirate games. To combat this, they came up with a simple but clever method to protect their software from any forms of backup. They also protected the console against different region discs being inserted. At first glance, if you insert a PlayStation 1 disc into a PC, you can easily read and dump the contents of the disc, and even make a backup copy. There was no obfuscation or encryption on these discs at all. Sony used the table of contents on the disc to store the region information of the game, but then at the mastering plant, a sophisticated technique pressed this data with what's known as the wobble groove. The wobble groove was read at boot up to determine the region encoding of the game, as well as force the copy protection on the disc. A consumer-grade CD burner was not capable of replicating the wobble groove during the burning process, so any backup copy that was made would be missing the wobble groove and simply be rejected by the PlayStation. And any different region disc would also be rejected when it was extracted from the wobble groove. The region encoding would not match what was on the PlayStation BIOS of the machine. While it was a very simple protection, the problem was, it wasn't very good. With a fast hand, you could perform what was known as the swap trick, whereby forcing the lid open on the PlayStation with a pen, you could boot from an original game, and when the disc would authenticate the wobble data and begin to boot into the game, you could quickly replace the disc with a backup. Since the PlayStation believes you've passed the region check, it will boot into the game that's on the disc, and by quickly swapping discs with a backup, you could get a backup to load on a PlayStation 1. This was a crude method, but it worked without a mod chip. And speaking of mod chips, it wasn't long after until mod chips started to appear that automated this process. With a backup disc that was inserted into the PlayStation 1, with a mod chip, the license string or region information would be sent back to authenticate automatically. This was a very simple and effective method, because the PlayStation 1 only wants to know if it's received back a valid region string. Sony's mistake here is that they relied heavily on CD burners being far too expensive for most consumers to buy, but they scrambled when the prices started to plummet. The PlayStation 1 was the birth of the mod chip as we know it. They were absolutely everywhere. Everyone had a mod chip installed in their PS1, and even to this day, if you go to a thrift store or eBay and buy a used PlayStation 1, there is a fairly large likelihood that there is actually a mod chip installed into the device. Sony realized they had a problem. The cost of a mod chip was cheap, and pretty soon anyone who owned a PlayStation wanted to install a chip in their system. You could even go down to your local Blockbuster, rent a few PS1 games, burn them, keep the copies, and return the originals. It also meant that releasing cracking groups started to appear and release games on bulletin boards and FTP sites worldwide. Groups such as Callisto, Paradox, Mups, Bad, and many others not only released games, but they also released trainers, or the ability to cheat in games. Adding cheat codes to most PlayStation 1 games was simple to do, because there was no security or memory guarding. You could easily poke or update certain memory locations. Trainers were simple to develop on the PlayStation 1. All that was needed was a simple interrupt to update specific memory locations. This was achieved using an event handler at a memory address. Essentially, this was the same method as the Action Replay cartridge on the PS1, but was installed with the game complete with a menu intro to set the options. At the time, cracking and release groups were quite experienced. Many of them came from the Amiga, so the cracking, training, and releasing of games was nothing new. With excellent coders, teams got quickly familiar with the PlayStation hardware. And in some countries in the world, you could actually buy high-quality bootleg PlayStation 1 games that would run without a mod chip, that were obviously not original copies, but utilized a custom firmware and a certain type of CD burner in order to replicate the wobble groove and allow you to play backup copies or illegal copies of PlayStation 1 games. For a few years, mod chipping and piracy was synonymous with the PlayStation 1. It seemed like nothing could be done, but in 1998, all of a sudden newer games that were coming out stopped working on mod chips, sometimes just with a black screen, or a freeze, or sometimes with this message. Sony had discovered a method to detect the presence of a mod chip. This was easy enough to do because the chip was always enabled. By simply running code to check for one, if it returned data back when it shouldn't have normally done so, meant that an external device was installed, and Sony added additional checks in many of their games to stop this. But this in turn led mod chip manufacturers to come up with the idea of a stealth mod chip, one that would activate at boot time, pass the authentication check, and then deactivate itself. But this isn't all that Sony had implemented. The second part of this protection utilized a 16-bit key that was stored in the subchannel data of a game CD-ROM. This protection was known as libcrypt, and there were 4 different protection methods that utilized libcrypt in some way. The protection itself works as follows. Somewhere in the game code is run to detect the presence of a mod chip, and the second part will decrypt the necessary 16-bit code from the libcrypt subchannel data in order to play the game. If the first check fails, then the game crashes outright. If the libcrypt check fails, an anti-piracy screen may be displayed, but in some cases, games will have features removed, like for example Theme Park disabled the new game feature in the main menu so you couldn't even play the game. Libcrypt was difficult to duplicate with a CD burner because many CD burners at the time did not even support writing subchannel data, and the ones that did almost made it impossible to make a one-to-one copy of that subchannel data. Even though stealth mod chips existed, now games needed to be cracked and the libcrypt protection removed. This again wasn't too difficult for the experienced cracking groups, but it was an extra step in the process. Sony's options were limited, and libcrypt was completely defeated very soon after it had come out. It wasn't difficult to identify and then extract the 16-bit key from the libcrypt subchannel tracks on the CD, and then completely just patch out the protection itself. And this was something that was fairly easy to do, and many cracking groups were skilled enough to remove the libcrypt protection. It became apparent that if the game developer and Sony stood any chance to defeat the pirates, it wouldn't be at the hardware level. Rather, it needed to be performed as part of the game. In one of the most well-documented cases of anti-piracy, Spyro the Dragon 3: Year of the Dragon implemented libcrypt, but also an additional layer of protection. Developer Insomniac knew that there was rampant CD piracy occurring on the PlayStation, and their previous game Spyro 2 implemented libcrypt, which was quickly dispatched by cracking group Paradox. For Spyro 3, they came up with something even more ingenious. Spyro 3 would allow you to play through the game, but when you got to Zoe early on, she would inform you that you were playing a hack copy of the game. But what was interesting was the game didn't kick you out, it continued to allow you to play through the game. But after a while, strange things started to happen. In PAL copies, games would randomly switch between English, French, German, and Spanish, and various enemies would not give gems, and sometimes gems found on the ground would be removed. But there were many more things. The game would sometimes return you to the wrong homeworld or level, and if you managed to get to the sorcerer boss fight, the player would be sent back to Sunrise Spring with all their save data wiped. Insomniac had implemented a series of CRC checksums in the code. This meant that even if a single bit was changed, it would result in an incorrect checksum and the game would fail its anti-piracy measure. Okay, so let's get technical for a sec. What is a CRC checksum? Well, in simple terms, it's something that is used for error detection, and it has many use cases. For example, if you want to guarantee the result of a set of bytes over a network, or if you want to make sure a file has not been tampered with, then you may use a CRC process. It was a perfect solution for Spyro 3 because the algorithm is fast, there is no apparent slowdown or disk access to run the check. The CRC will take an input string or an array of bytes and apply that against a magic number or a divisor, and the output will be a value which matches the same number of bits as the input value. This is important to remember because it means that a cracker could easily manipulate the divisor or magic number in order to make it equal to what the game was expecting. But Insomniac programmer Gavin Dodd knew that this may be a weak point and obfuscated the CRC checks by adding additional checks in the same blocks of code, but at different offsets. And to further complicate things, he even used the checksum result value as part of the data being checksummed. There was also no CRC check function call, which again would have been easy to spot and patch out by crackers. Rather, the checks were inlined in code, so the compiler would just apply it to the main block of code that was being run. With just 1 byte of difference in the code would fail one or any number of CRC checks, and the crack protection would kick in. Gavin knew that crackers would have to patch out libcrypt, which invalidated the copy, and that was enough to trigger the protection. When the game was released, a few different scene groups released their crack of the game, including Bad, who patched the libcrypt 2 protection, and then Paradox released a crack of the game as well. But both of these were non-working. The crack protection was still in place. It took almost 2 months later for Paradox to release an updated Spyro 3 that was 100% patched. I reached out to the cracker known as BabyDoc to learn more about this crack. His method was to write code to hook into the game, and after the game had loaded, he injected a bypass of the protection and then reapplied the original data, so when the checksum was performed, the test would be correct. Sounds simple enough, but it was far from. Back in 1999, it was a different time. There wasn't anywhere near as much knowledge base information on PlayStation hardware, so they had to learn things and share information themselves. However, Paradox used an official development kit that had a homemade loader on it to boot into retail games. This meant they had access to snoop memory, and this is how Spyro 3 was able to be defeated. BabyDoc spent 2 weeks extracting all the data, comparing the memory dumps from an original copy of the game, and repackaging it into a new file system. He had to identify all the checksums, and he had to be certain that all the checksums were caught, bypassed and reapplied with original data. This was a complicated and long process. When I asked why go to the trouble, for him it was a challenge, it was fun, there was no money involved, just knowing that you could crack a complicated protection would make you one of the best crackers in the world. For Sony and Insomniac, this protection held up. After all, the first 2 to 3 weeks is where you make the majority of money selling the game on retail shelves. Insomniac knew the game would be cracked eventually, but it stood firm when it needed to. But in reality, there are only a small handful of games that had any additional crack protection. There was a cost associated to it, and it was pushed onto the development house. And in most cases, there wasn't enough time, money and resources to consider doing it. While the PlayStation 1 sold over 100 million systems and was a worldwide success, it was also the game console that started the mod chip craze and brought it to the household. When we think about game consoles and modding them, either via hard or soft modding techniques, what do you think would be the 3 main reasons to defeat security on the system? The first motivation is simple: piracy, or the ability to play backups. Many people want this option to play games on their system, either by buying a copy and making a backup of it, or just by downloading or burning a copy onto disk or onto flash storage media. The second is homebrew, being able to run emulators and open source homebrew that were not licensed for the system. And with emulators like RetroArch, a large number of different systems can be run very quickly on the target hardware. The Nintendo Switch release of RetroArch, for example, had over 20 cores running on day one, providing developers and end users with the freedom to play what they want is very powerful. And the third motivation is to run Linux. Linux runs on just about everything, and to many people, the word Linux means freedom. It allows the user to turn their system into a computer with a desktop interface, the ability to surf the web, play media, write code, render images, attach a keyboard and mouse and play Doom. All this and much, much more. Although I was very much a part of the original Xbox homebrew community, I was not involved in any of the exploit discoveries that ultimately led to the security on the Xbox being defeated. But what I can tell you, there were forums such as Xbox Hacker that had files on top of files of very important information. Things like high-res screenshots of the motherboards, data sheets of all the chips, code samples, proof of concepts, XBE header information, all sorts of different information that you could possibly think of was available for people to research and review. If we consider the original Xbox, it was designed to keep hackers at bay by locking out any and all software that was not signed by Microsoft. If you attempted to copy a game disc, it would not boot. If you got your hands on an official XDK, compiled an Xbox executable, burnt it onto a CD, it would not boot either. Anything that was unsigned was ignored, and the key to sign executables is stored somewhere at Microsoft HQ in a safe that will never be opened. But rather than attempt to crack the key itself, the best way to exploit the system is to simply make the key irrelevant. If we compare security on the Nintendo GameCube, the Sony PlayStation 2 and the original Xbox, it's true that the Xbox was compromised first, and it could be easily argued that this was because the security system was deeply flawed. Michael Stile, who was a security researcher and the founder of the Xbox Linux project, once said that the reason why it took longer for the PlayStation 2 to get hacked was because Sony had made Linux available. Therefore, it removed those groups of individuals from the equation of hackers who wanted to defeat the system. Sony had already given it to them. In contrast, witness when Sony removed Linux or other OS from the PlayStation 3 in 2010, it sparked a calculated and large effort of different individuals identifying potential weaknesses and flaws in the hardware, and it was only a few short months after that the system was completely busted wide open. Microsoft had a very aggressive timeline for the Xbox. Original prototypes used PC hardware, and the retail console, as we know, consists of a Pentium 3 processor, 64MB of DDR memory, NVIDIA GeForce graphics, an IDE hard drive, USB for the game ports, and a modified Windows 2000 kernel. The motherboard even contained a north bridge and a south bridge, things that are standard on a PC. For those unaware, the south bridge contains the core logic of the motherboard, and in the case of the Xbox, it's the MCP-X chip by NVIDIA. So it made sense that the first discovery was the hard disk. It was simply removed from the Xbox and plugged into a PC and powered up. It was thought that there would be a kernel installed on the hard disk somewhere, and it was discovered that there was a file system similar to FAT32, and it wasn't difficult to access the partitions. While no kernel was found, the dashboard code was discovered on the third partition. If we turn our attention to the Xbox motherboard, it contains flash memory on this chip. It was quickly extracted and dumped by Andrew Bunny Wang, an MIT student at the time. He identified while the flash was encrypted, the upper 512 bytes was not. He ran a few tests, even zeroing out the entire 512 bytes, but his Xbox still booted. It turns out that the 512 bytes contained code of an old version of something known as the secret ROM, which Microsoft used to obfuscate the boot process, and embarrassing for Microsoft, was unintentionally left on the flash. Bunny identified that the secret ROM lived on the south bridge, or the MCP-X chip we talked about earlier, and because the flash that he had extracted earlier was encrypted, he assumed correctly that the key must live in the secret ROM. Luckily for Microsoft, the old version of the secret ROM that was accidentally left on the encrypted flash did not contain the retail key that was used to decrypt the flash, but this was only a temporary win. Bunny then built hardware to sniff data along the hypertransport bus, the address and data lines between the CPU and the south bridge, and captured the boot process. He was able to extract the key as well as dump the secret ROM, and with this key was able to decrypt the flash memory, which contained the modified Windows 2000 kernel. Bunny published his findings and even hosted a copy of the kernel on his website. There's the now infamous voicemail from a Microsoft employee asking him to take it down, otherwise get slapped with a cease and desist.
Andrew, my name is John Thomason with the Microsoft Xbox Group. like to chat with you a little bit concerning the ROM image you have up on your website. We'd certainly like to have you remove that if you could.
But it didn't matter. Now that his method was made public, it was easier for hackers to patch the kernel to allow unsigned executables to run, as well as running them from blank CDs and DVDs. The first mod chips on the market contained patch code and were wired in parallel with the existing kernel, and these added patches on startup. These mod chips, known as the Extender and the Enigma, were the first 29-wire mod chips on the market. But these mod chips only stayed on the market for a few short months. It was quickly discovered by completely removing the flash chip, the Xbox tries to interface with the LPC or serial header to read a ROM from there. This was a side effect of the manufacturing process. The kernel chips are programmed in-system via an external ROM chip connected to the LPC port. Mod chip manufacturers replicated this approach with a simple 9-wire mod chip known as cheap mods. As far as hardware modding goes, the LPC mod method is the cheapest and easiest way to mod your Xbox even to this day. After the launch and failure of the Xbox security system, Microsoft had a problem on their hands. They responded by releasing version 1.1 of the Xbox motherboard, which should have patched the mistakes of the 1.0 version. This had a new secret ROM, a new decryption key, and a new algorithm to decrypt the key. Microsoft felt like they had taken care of the problem once and for all. But the secret ROM was still embedded in the South Bridge. Microsoft was unwilling to move it to the CPU, which would have greatly secured the system, but at the cost of millions of dollars in re-engineering new motherboards. Earlier in the episode, I talked about how different teams were working together to ultimately defeat the security system in place, and this time it was the Xbox Linux project team. They were aware of a legacy feature with x86 chips, including the Pentium 3 found in the Xbox. By simply grounding an address pin on the CPU would start the boot process from a different address region and completely bypass the secret ROM. But even when this occurred, the secret ROM was resident in memory and there for the taking. And with a simple dumper program, that's exactly what they did. Microsoft also changed the decryption method on 1.1 revisions, but the new method was easily exploitable, known as TEA. It's insecure and was quickly defeated. Microsoft never revised the secret ROM after the 1.1 revision, and to this day on every single Xbox, they all still live on the Southbridge chip. But this is not the end of the story. Microsoft removed the LPC header from their 1.6 Xbox and removed the flash memory chip in place of a ROM which was integrated into the video encoder, so there was no way to reprogram this anymore. But a mod chip on a 1.6 Xbox is still simple to do. Although the LPC header was removed, the pins still exist, only they are harder to locate and install. Microsoft made it harder to hack a 1.6 Xbox, but in the end, the result was the same. Everything that we've covered so far has to do with hardware modification of the original Xbox, but there were two areas of software that Microsoft did not wrap any security around. They were save games and fonts. We determined earlier that any code on the Xbox that was loaded and executed needed to be signed by Microsoft. Things like executables, graphics and audio data, but save games were not signed and could easily be modified. You could move them simply from your hard disk to USB and back again. It meant that buffer overflows could have been exploited. An example of this is if you consider a game where you enter a player name. If behind the scenes the player name code only accepts a 10-character name, but the UI allows you to enter 20, it may trigger a buffer overflow. The original Xbox had no hypervisor or privileged levels of access, and although it ran a custom Windows 2000 kernel, the system and games ran with full access and control of the machine. Therefore, by embedding a piece of unsigned code in the save game file meant that by triggering a buffer overflow it would execute this code, which could have been a custom dashboard, file manager, BIOS dumper, almost anything was possible. But it didn't stop there. Even with the save game exploit, unless you flashed a custom BIOS onto the flash chip which required opening up the machine and bridging two solder points, you would need to reload this save game hack on every boot. But the save game exploit meant full read-write access to the file system. It was discovered that two font files that the Microsoft dashboard loads are unsigned. The Xbox Linux project team made this discovery, and by replacing these fonts with their own and embedding code inside those font files meant on each reboot, the dashboard would crash and load from the embedded files. Both of these two exploits form the basis of the traditional soft modding techniques for the Xbox as we know it today. Microsoft tried to patch the save game exploit and font exploits in later dashboard revisions, but they could not prevent it. The program known as Dash Update checks for the Xbox Live functionality on the dashboard and adds it if it's not available. It checks every time an Xbox Live enabled game disc is inserted and loaded. The problem was, the dashboard update that came out with just about every single Xbox game disc contained this font exploit as well. So there was no way Microsoft could blacklist this update. This would mean that game discs would no longer work. They were out of options. Security on the original Xbox was a disaster. Microsoft licked their wounds and focused their attention to the next gen, where they would invest millions into the security of the Xbox 360. The Sony PlayStation 2 is still the world's largest selling console with over 150 million units sold. The PlayStation 2 greatly improved on the technology of the original PlayStation 1, and it was a true evolution in console video gaming. Sony learned from the mistakes of the PS1 with the rampant mod chipping and piracy and came up with a more elaborate copy protection scheme to thwart pirates and modders attempting to play unauthorized backups on the system. To better understand how the PlayStation 2 locked pirates out of its system, let's do a quick run through of the PlayStation 1 security. The PlayStation 1 was region locked depending on where you bought your system from, and there was no EEPROM or jumper setting on the motherboard that you could use to change it. It was all hard-coded on the PS1. The discs themselves had a simple but effective copy protection method. Original discs were pressed with a watermark, which also contained the region code of the game. The watermark was only pressed onto original discs. Consumer-grade CD burners are not capable of writing this watermark due to the way that data was burnt onto the disc, so although you could easily read PlayStation 1 discs in a regular PC drive and make a copy of the game, it would not boot on a PlayStation 1. This is because when an original is put into the drive, the watermark is read and the region code is accessed from the disc. If it matches the region code on the PlayStation 1 motherboard, the game boots. Simple enough. It also meant that it was simple enough to emulate the watermark and circumvent the region check to boot a copied version of the game with a simple mod chip. Sony definitely learned from their mistakes of the Sony PlayStation 1 security, from the simple swap trick method to the mod chips that ultimately bypassed and defeated the security wobble and the watermark mechanism on the PlayStation 1 discs. Now with the PlayStation 2, Sony stepped up security greatly, but as we will find out, there were still ways to defeat the system that we're going to take a look at and deep dive into. When Sony was developing the PlayStation 2, enhancing security was essential, and Sony had learned from its mistakes of the PS1. Games were growing with size. Many games on the PlayStation 1 towards the end of its life cycle were multi-disc games. The PlayStation 2 was upgraded from a CD to a DVD, and also its copy protection was beefed up significantly. This is kinda how it went. The famous PlayStation 2 logo that you see when you boot up into a game is actually stored on the disc itself. It's encrypted in the first 16 sectors of the disc. Like the PlayStation 1, the PlayStation 2 has a watermark pressed onto it that can't be burnt with a normal DVD burner. The key to decrypt the logo is in the watermark data, and that decryption key is also encrypted by using the product code of the disc, which is spread across different sectors on the disc. One common myth about both PS1 and PS2 discs is the color of the discs. They were very easy to make backup copies of. It was mainly used to illustrate that you were using a legit copy of the game as opposed to a high quality reproduction. With this knowledge and understanding of how the PlayStation 2 boot process worked, it wasn't long before hardware mod chip manufacturers came into the market with their products. The earliest mod chips were crude and needed to work in conjunction with a disc like an Action Replay or a Game Shark. While not the first mod on the market, the Neo key worked by first inserting the Action Replay disc, then swapping in the real game. Initially, this only worked with PlayStation 2 CD-based games and not DVD games. The mod authenticated the backup copy as a PlayStation 1 disc, but the Action Replay or Game Shark treated it like a PlayStation 2 CD and the game would boot. Authenticating PlayStation 2 DVDs was trickier, but eventually worked around as well. One of the most important chips on the PlayStation 2 is the Mechacon. It's responsible for controlling the CD and DVD drive. Think of it more like a hypervisor for the DVD drive. All original PlayStation 2 DVDs have a media flag setting of DVD-ROM. If the Mechacon detected the media flag DVD-ROM coming from the disc, the game would boot. Making a simple copy of a game DVD would not boot because the book type or media flag would be set to DVD plus R. This was fixed by patching some wires from the mod chip to the Mechacon to hardwire the media bit DVD-ROM regardless if an original or a backup copy was inserted. Right after the Neo key, the first no-swap mod chip known as the Messiah came onto the market and it was very successful. Mod chipping a PlayStation 2 was complicated. Unlike the original Xbox, the no-swap chips required up to 20 wires to be soldered onto the motherboard. This wasn't a job for beginners, so many people would pay modders high prices to chip their systems. Sony was aware of what was going on and in 2004 won a landmark case against a man, David Bell, who was selling and installing Messiah chips. But this did little to stop the market, and to this day mod chips are still for sale on the Sony PlayStation 2, including the Modbo and others. They all use the same 20-wire method as the Messiah, become with more modern features. But mod chipping wasn't the only option to defeat copy protection on the PlayStation 2. Remember, the PlayStation 1 used a simple swap trick method that would allow you to keep the drive tray open while the disc was spinning. The trick was, after the watermark of the original disc was read and authenticated, you could swap in your backup copy and boot into a copy of that game. And although the PlayStation 2 had a much more complicated boot and security process, it turns out you could perform a very similar hack. Now, I get a lot of questions on the channel asking me what's the deal with your Sony PlayStation 2 Slim. I've never seen a Sony PlayStation 2 Slim look like that before. The short answer is it's just a regular Sony PlayStation 2 Slim with an aftermarket modification, which is known as the Swap Magic. Both the PlayStation 2 Fat and Slim have sensors to detect if a disc is ejected. On my PlayStation 2 Slim, it has 3 sensors. This lid bypasses the PS2's eject sensor and uses a trick known as Swap Magic. It's just one of many ways that the Sony PlayStation 2 was modded to allow backup games, region-free, copy-protected games, and homebrew to run. Swap Magic works by inserting a PlayStation 2 press disc that was created by Daytel that is inserted into the system when you power it on. Then, by flipping up the lid and replacing it with your backup copy of the game, it simply allows the swapping of PlayStation 2 discs without the system being aware. This was the first of the soft modding methods that were used. The Swap Magic disc has the watermark and all authentication checks in place. It's not clear how Daytel managed to pull this off, but one theory is they likely spliced the watermark and boot sectors onto their own discs. Now, if anyone knows more about how Daytel managed to pull this off, I'd certainly be interested. Leave a comment below or email me. Once the Swap Magic disc boots, it has intentional bad sectors on it. The PlayStation 2 retries a few times to read these sectors, but eventually the motor will stop. And then all you need to do is pop open the lid, which won't affect the eject sensors, and the backup disc will boot and load just like an original disc. The Swap Magic trick is clever and still works to this day. But along came a newer method that would become the final form of all PlayStation 2 modding. The best mods are often the simplest, the ones that don't require you to open up the system and solder 20 wires. FreeMcBoot falls into that category. By inserting a memory card into the PlayStation 2 and booting it up, it loads a custom menu known as FreeMcBoot. From here you can run homebrew, browse files, manipulate save games, boot backups, and much more. But how is this possible? Loading homebrew code from a memory card seems like it would be the first thing that Sony would have patched out. The PlayStation 2 was designed to be upgradable by utilizing, you guessed it, the memory card. Sony's plan to do this was to release an update disc, and the update would install itself onto the memory card. When you would boot the PlayStation 2, the memory card would load its update and then boot into the system. So by removing the memory card would downgrade you back to whatever the PlayStation 2 BIOS was running under. The PlayStation 2 had no NAND or flashable EEPROM to persist the update. It was performed on the memory card. Sony released one update disc in Japan, but the method was quickly scrapped as it was too easy to bypass the update or just downgrade when you wanted to by simply removing the memory card. Although Sony stopped bringing updates out, they never removed this ability from the PlayStation 2 and allowed it to be updated. And this is how FreeMcBoot works. It tricks the system into believing it's a memory card with an official update installed onto it, except of course, it's a full menu full of loaders and utilities to run backups and homebrew. The FreeMcBoot exploit works on almost all PlayStation 2 hardware, including the original Fat models and all Slim models up to the 9000X model where it was patched. FreeMcBoot also runs on the Japanese PSX, and it's actually recommended that you do this to minimize hard drive access in order to preserve the lifetime of the system. I covered the Japanese Sony PSX in a previous episode and all the potential issues it has. Check it out if you're interested. FreeMcBoot works very well, but it has one main issue. It won't boot backup DVDs. This is because FreeMcBoot only allows ELF binaries to load and run like homebrew. However, FreeMcBoot comes with loaders to allow backups to play. The first is known as ESR. One of the big selling points of the PlayStation 2 was to support video DVDs. It even supports playing backup copies. So by patching a game disc to be multi-session and including video DVD playback on the first session and the game data on the second, the PlayStation 2 will allow the disc to boot thinking that it's a video DVD and pass its authentication check. Then ESR will mount the second session on the disc with the game data and boot into the game as normal. This method requires a backup of the game patched in the multi-session format that ESR expects and will only work on FreeMcBoot and not via traditional mod chip or swap methods. And the second and more popular method these days is the Open PS2 Loader or OPL. This allows unmodified disk images or ISOs to boot and run from external USB, hard drives, and even over the network shares via SMB or Samba. It's the most popular method of running PS2 backups to this day, and like FreeMcBoot, it's still very much in active development. And that's where we are at today. There were other methods of defeating PlayStation 2 security, but in summary we went from original mod chips to swap magic to FreeMcBoot. Sony put much more time and resources into tightening up security on the PlayStation 2, but with its huge fan base and expert security researchers and reversers, meant it was inevitable that the system would be defeated. Swap magic still remains a very useful way to boot into backups and homebrew, and the FreeMcBoot exploit on a simple memory card was a simple oversight by Sony. But no matter what, the Sony PlayStation 2 still remains a fantastic system after all these years. One definitely worth revisiting, or if you haven't already, do yourself a favor and jump in for the first time. The Nintendo GameCube, codenamed Dolphin, was released in Japan in late 2001 and represented the first Nintendo system that utilized an optical drive as its storage medium. It was also the first Nintendo console to use the PowerPC architecture, something that Nintendo stuck with all the way up to the Nintendo Wii U. Microsoft and Sony also transitioned to PowerPC with the Xbox 360 and Sony PlayStation 3 respectively. The GameCube CPU processor was a variant of the PowerPC 730 chip, which was nicknamed Gecko, which ran at a very respectable 486 MHz. The GPU was known as the Flipper chip and was developed by ArtX, now known as ATI. It contained 2.5 MB of frame buffer, which was plenty for rendering 480p progressive scan scenes. Nintendo focused much of its efforts on the hardware, packing quite a lot of power and performance into a small cube form factor. Games like Star Wars Rogue Squadron were capable of pushing an average of 12 million polygons per second, a very impressive feat. Nintendo was no stranger to software piracy, with the Super Nintendo and Nintendo 64 utilizing disc-based copiers, and they knew with the optical drive on the GameCube would be one of the target areas for hackers, so they implemented copy protection and obfuscated the disc media. Attempting to insert an original game disc into a PC drive won't even see that a new disc has been inserted, and if this copy protection was not present on the disc, the GameCube's firmware would refuse to read the disc. Nintendo implemented copy protection to thwart pirates and any unauthorized booting of backup copies, and its DVD firmware ensured that any illegal backups were locked out of the system. In other words, they didn't even boot at all. But the Nintendo GameCube had no concept of key signing. In other words, if a hacker somehow figured out how to upload code to the GameCube, the system was perfectly capable of executing it. And as it turns out, in 2003, this is exactly what happened. Phantasy Star Online, or PSO, was a popular online RPG developed by the Sonic team for the Sega Dreamcast in 2001. When the GameCube launched, Sonic team announced that a version of PSO was in development for the GameCube. It was also one of the first GameCube titles to take advantage of the broadband adapter for online play. The GameCube port of PSO was able to keep itself updated by downloading new patches or versions of its game executable from central PSO servers. Hackers determined by changing the DNS and IP address, it was easy to trick the game to connect to a simple program running on a PC. This program essentially masquerades itself as a PSO server that's listening for a connection and allows the user to push a GameCube executable or a DOL file to the GameCube and execute it. The PSO exploit was also used to develop homebrew tools to rip original discs. As mentioned, these were 1.2 gigabytes in size, and the exploit in turn could be used to stream the content of the disc over the network. This was the earliest attempts to run backups on the GameCube. This exploit was known as PSO load, and it was the earliest attempts at soft modding on the Nintendo GameCube. The PSO exploit worked very well at the time, but its main issue was you needed to boot into PSO every time you'd want to launch Homebrew, and it was quite fiddly to do. And while the hacking community was busy loading Homebrew over the network with PSO and a broadband adapter, the company known as Daytel were researching the GameCube DVD format and its copy protection. In 2003, they released a tool known as the Freeloader, which allowed you to boot into any region GameCube disc. They quickly followed this up with the Action Replay, a disc full of cheat codes for many different GameCube games. What's interesting about both of these discs are they are not licensed by Nintendo and therefore do not contain any copy protection at all. So then how does Daytel manage to boot unlicensed discs on GameCube hardware? To understand this better, let's take a look at a typical GameCube game DVD. The disc itself is nothing more than a mini DVD with 1.2 gigabytes of storage on it like we said previously, but its data format is obfuscated. When you attempt to insert a GameCube disc into a PC, the disc doesn't even appear to be located. So what's going on here? Each individual GameCube disc has a unique identifier burnt onto the disc. This is done during mastering with a special laser, which is not found on consumer DVD burners. This identifier is known as BCA, or the burst cutting area. Each GameCube disc has 6 unique marks of equal distance burnt onto the disc. This is also part of the mastering process. The BCA data is encrypted, but with a simple homebrew program to read the contents of the drive's memory after a disc has been authenticated means that the decrypted BCA data can be captured. The decrypted BCA data references the physical sector locations of each of the 6 marks on the disc, and this formed the basis of the copy protection found on the GameCube. Nintendo's plan here was that they knew that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to replicate those 6 marks, and even if you had the precision hardware to do so, the BCA verifies the exact place where these marks should be, and you would need to mark all 6 in the same exact position as an original disc. So with all this information discovery, Daytel obviously were not able to burn the BCA and 6 unique marks on their Action Replay and Freeloader discs, so how did they pull this off? Quite simply, they took the BCA data that the GameCube expects and burnt it onto the first few sectors of the disc, complete with the same stream of bytes after the GameCube has read data from all 6 of the marks, to fool the DVD reader into thinking that the marks are in the right place. The copy protection has no concept if there were actual physical markings on the disc, it just cares if the response data after reading the markings is correct. Daytel simply applied their own BCA data that contained the correct bitstream to simulate these markings. Now the question now becomes, why wasn't the Daytel method of running backups and defeating the copy protection used in the scene? The simple answer is because there were a lot of people that weren't really sure how Daytel managed to pull this off, and by the time people did figure it out, there was already other more advanced methods of running GameCube backups and homebrew on the Nintendo GameCube. While Daytel had cracked the DVD copy protection, hackers found a new method of booting into homebrew that did not require a broadband adapter. The Daytel Action Replay disc, as we will quickly understand, became a very important tool for all things homebrew on the GameCube. Entering a 29-line code would patch the GameCube's memory and allow for an SD card to read from the first sector. If this sector contained a DOL executable or a homebrew loader, the Action Replay with this unique code could launch homebrew without the need of a broadband adapter and PSO. This method had different names, but it was originally known as the Samson AR loader or SD load. This method was refined to what it is today. Later on, Daytel released the SD Media Launcher, while it takes the same method but makes it much more user-friendly enough so you don't have to worry about entering Action Replay codes. Now, all these soft modding techniques work quite well, but all of them were based around the Action Replay. So in other words, you'd have to install the Action Replay disc in order to run homebrew on the Nintendo GameCube. But the GameCube hacking scene was just getting started, with the next level of exploits starting to be released that involved the GameCube BIOS, or IPL. The GameCube BIOS, known as the IPL or Initial Program Loader, was encrypted on the GameCube. By simply replacing this BIOS via hardware modding techniques with a customized version, it could patch and open up many features of the GameCube, including the removal of the DVD copy protection, booting into Homebrew from memory cards and over the network, USB loaders, and much more. But how was this accomplished? The boot process was connected to the GameCube's external interface bus or EXE bus. The EXE bus has a major flaw, in that whatever data is sent into the bus is sent out shifted right, but the shift register was never cleared once the decrypted data was in. Therefore, with the right hardware, it was possible to recover the key stream and extract the decrypted IPL. The first open source IPL replacement was released in 2004. It did not allow for booting of backup games, but allowed for homebrew, but it wasn't long before mod chips started to appear. The Viper GC was the first IPL replacement mod chip released in 2004 that had many unique features, including unlocking the DVD drive so regular-sized DVD discs could boot backups and more. Other IPL replacement mod chips came later, including the Cube and the Ripper 3. These chips only needed 7 wires to replace the existing IPL, and they were popular for many years. Following the IPL-based mod chips, the more recent methods of modding the GameCube was to use a simple device to communicate with the GameCube's DVD drive debug port and put it into debug mode. From here, commands can be sent to patch the drive to accept regular DVD media and bypass these protection methods. The popular chip known as the Xeno GC utilizes this method. Known as a drive chip, the Xeno GC is completely open source and there are hundreds of clones on the market today. This is by far the easiest and cheapest way to hard mod your Nintendo GameCube, but keep in mind, unless you boot homebrew from the DVD drive, you will still need an IPL based mod chip or an action replay based SD loader to boot into your homebrew. And finally, there is the WODE, or the Wii Optical Drive Emulator, a total replacement for the Nintendo Wii and GameCube to play backups from mass storage. This also comes with a replacement IPL to enable disk ripping and USB support. Like the original Xbox, the GameCube also suffers from save game exploits, and as of the making of this video, there are 12 titles that are exploitable to boot into homebrew. These exploits are still being discovered and used today. Nintendo certainly learned much from the GameCube and the security around it. They made a concerted effort to greatly increase security of their follow-up, the Nintendo Wii. But with the Nintendo Wii supporting GameCube backward compatibility in hardware, it was only a matter of time before security on that system would be defeated too. When we think about the Nintendo Wii and its security, the first thought is how easy it is to hack. Copy a few files to the SD card, run an exploit, and literally in minutes you are up and running with the homebrew channel and all the emulators and apps at your disposal. But initially, hacking the Wii was very difficult. After the GameCube, Nintendo learned a thing or two and stepped up their efforts to tighten security. The system was released in 2006, 1 year after the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. And with its much broader demographic, it was a smash hit, selling over 100 million units and still holding the sales record for the most consoles sold in a single month way back in 2009. The Wii was the successor to the Nintendo GameCube and was fully backward compatible with the GameCube on the RVL001 launch model, but the first revision, the RVL101 and then the RVL201, also known as the Wii Mini, had GameCube backward compatibility removed. The CPU inside the Wii was a 740MHz PowerPC chip known as Broadway, but this was just for all intents and purposes a PowerPC 750 chip. The GPU, codenamed Hollywood, was designed by ATI and runs at 240MHz. The Wii also has 88MB of total main memory, with 64MB of this as external GDDR3 RAM. The system has 512MB of built-in flash NAND memory and is also expandable via SD card, and of course contains a slot-loading disk drive which is compatible with Wii and GameCube discs, assuming that you have the backward compatible revision. At launch, the Wii was a target for hackers. After all, it's new hardware and has untapped potential. Its backward compatibility with the GameCube made that feature the first obvious weak point. The GameCube did not require code signing. So if code had managed to be installed into the GameCube's main memory, it could be easily executed with full privileges. The GameCube's disk drive could also easily be modified by setting it into debug mode and changing some drive settings to allow for backup and region-free games to boot. Now, the DVD drive found in the Nintendo Wii is very similar to the one in the GameCube. It's the same manufacturer, and the board itself, the controller board, is very, very similar. And because the Nintendo Wii has backward compatibility with GameCube games, it was the first area where hackers decided to focus their attention on. In theory, this same DVD debug hack found on the GameCube could be applied to the Nintendo Wii. It was first discovered by researchers Felix Domke and Michael Stile in 2006, just a few weeks after the launch of the Nintendo Wii. But in practice, things were a little trickier than this. At the end of 2007, an early Wii hack was demonstrated by Felix Domke and security researcher Ben Beyer that allowed for homebrew on the system that ran outside of GameCube mode. This hack required extraction of the signing keys for the Wii, but there was no simple way to do this without hardware modification. This was still a very early work in progress and under research. It wasn't certain if this method would ever be released to the public. It was clear that Nintendo took many steps to tighten security on the Wii. The GameCube mode runs in its own sandbox, which means there is no access to any Wii features at all. This means no SD cards, no Wiimotes, no Wi-Fi, and no Bluetooth. So even if there was a way to boot homebrew, it would be confined to GameCube mode only. The earliest mod chips were released in 2007, known as the Wii Key. It took a similar approach to the Xbox 360 DVD firmware hacks at around the same time. The Wii's DVD drive was not encrypted at all, so a simple circuit to trick the drive into thinking that it was loading legitimate games would work, but this did not allow for any homebrew or unsigned code to run. Breaking into the Wii was going to be tough. Games were encrypted, signed, and identified by a unique title ID, and in order to decrypt these titles, a license key is required. Initially, snooping around to figure out where this key lived came up short. It was assumed to live in the NAND flash, but this turned out to be incorrect. During some investigations of a system update file on a Wii disc, it became apparent that the system update was not using PowerPC code at all. Rather, it was using ARM code. But how? Remember, the Wii is a PowerPC based device. It turns out that the Hollywood GPU chip houses an additional ARM9 processor that's used to handle I/O, security, and much more. This ARM9 processor was nicknamed Starlet by a security researcher who went by the name Sega. The master key used to decrypt game titles was unique to each console and was burned into the one-time programmable ROM or OTP at the manufacturing plant. The key lived inside the Starlet chip and there was no easy way to extract it. Oh, and the key can never be altered. In fact, the Wii's entire boot process does not touch any PowerPC code at all. The main PowerPC chip is completely inactive until the Wii's operating system known as iOS is loaded and ready to take user commands. iOS interacts with the Broadway only through high-level API calls, and there is never any direct access and everything is encrypted. iOS runs on internal SRAM and the Broadway PowerPC chip can't use this area, it's completely protected. This time around, Nintendo secured their hardware extremely well, or so they thought. I mentioned earlier that the earliest attacks on the Wii hardware was utilizing the GameCube sandbox mode. Now, there are a couple of discoveries that were made here, but ultimately they could run GameCube homebrew, but they were still confined in the sandbox itself. There was no easy way or no known way at the time to breach those perimeters and start accessing the Wii mode itself. But as it turns out, the GameCube mode was ultimately what caused the failure of the security system found in the Nintendo Wii. When you insert a GameCube disc into the Wii, it will first boot into Wii mode and then reboot into GameCube sandbox mode, and while it's in this mode, it allocates and uses the first 16 megabytes of the entire 64 megabytes of RAM known as MEM2, and of course iOS is completely disabled. The upper 48 megabytes is not readable because the Starlet chip protects against it. However, because the RAM is just external off-the-shelf GDDR3 memory chips with address and data lines, by using a pair of tweezers to set some pins low when they should have been high, exposed the upper 48 megabytes of data. But it gets better. By building memory dumping hardware that exploited the GameCube controller port circuit, the entire 64 megabytes of MEM2 could be dumped and examined. It turns out that the upper 48 megabytes of MEM2 was not cleared out while in GameCube mode and contained leftover code from iOS. So by using a pair of tweezers bridging points across different address lines on the chip, it was possible to slide the 16 megabytes of GameCube memory throughout the entire 64 megabytes of memory space, which exposed more of the leftover iOS code, and from here was easily able to reconstruct the entire iOS dump. And as an added bonus, when examining memory dumps, all the global and per console keys that were hidden away in the Starlet were discovered, there for the taking, including the one used to decrypt game titles. With a full iOS dump and access to keys, the researchers, who had now called themselves Team Tweezers, went into full swing examining iOS in great detail. The goal was to boot Linux on the Wii. However, even with the discovery of the keys, Nintendo must still approve all software that runs on the Wii itself. Before running any code, iOS checks the RSA1 signature against the SHA1 hash of the content itself, which is digitally signed by Nintendo, and execution will fail if there is no match. Nintendo's RSA implementation contained a critical flaw. They used the C string compare function that has the side effect of terminating when null is found. Nintendo was passing in byte values to the string compare, so in the event of null bytes found early in the hash, meant that brute forcing the SHA1 hash could be performed in minutes, and that in turn allowed for digital signatures to be easily faked. This meant that all software could be fake signed and installed on iOS that was not approved. But remember, Team Tweezer's motivation was to come up with a way to run Linux on the Wii. They could fake sign, but they still needed a method to install code on the Wii without resorting to modding, so they decided to look up save game exploits. Unlike the original Xbox, the Nintendo Wii digitally signed save files utilizing the console-specific key on the Wii. This meant that you couldn't tamper with the save files to hack them for, say, extra lives or unlimited energy. But since Team Tweezers had discovered all per console keys when they dumped iOS from MEM2, they were able to modify and re-sign any save game. They discovered a buffer overflow exploit in The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. By modifying the save file and adding a small loader that would execute PowerPC Broadway code, it was easy enough to execute a custom loader. This was known as the Twilight hack, which was the first public way of enabling homebrew on the Wii without any modification to hardware. It was released in 2008, and it took Nintendo 2 revisions and around 12 months to ultimately patch the Twilight hack. These days, the Twilight hack is obsolete and no longer works in favor of newer and easier methods such as Banner Bomb. But if it wasn't for a single pair of tweezers and the brilliant work done by Team Tweezers, who now go by Fail Overflow, the Nintendo Wii may have stayed secure for a lot longer. Hello World. A simple computer program to demonstrate that things are working. A sanity test to make sure that the machine knows how to run your code. It's most likely the first piece of code you'll ever write, especially when learning a new programming language. Hello World was also the first piece of homebrew ever to run on the Sony PSP. It was April of 2005 when developer Nem started playing around with his PSP. Wipeout Pure was a launch title for the PSP, and it was also the first PSP title to feature downloadable content. With a simple DNS redirection trick, the downloading feature in Wipeout allowed HTML pages to render. This feature turned out to be a fully enabled web browser. So with some trial and error, and with the DNS trick, pointing the path to the mounted UMD drive allowed the entire contents of the UMD to be displayed, and from here it was quickly learned that the PSP executable name is called eboot.bin. Nem then proceeded to dump the PSP system ROM or firmware, and with this discovery had enough information to reverse engineer the executable format. He also learned that it was possible to run standard ELF binaries on the PSP. From here, it only took him a few days to write a simple program to show something on the screen. That program was Hello World. But how was this even possible? After the rampant mod chipping of the PlayStation 1 and 2, and with their rivals Microsoft and their Xbox, surely Sony had secured the PSP from any unauthorized tampering. Well, no. After announcing the PSP in Japan right after E3 in 2003, Sony launched the PSP in the holiday season of the following year. It sold very well at launch, with North America having to wait until March of 2005 for their turn. Code signing is the process of an executable to confirm that the code has not been altered or tampered with. Executables are signed with a private key that is typically locked in a vault that would never be opened. At launch, the Japanese PSP system came installed with firmware 1.0 and inexplicably allowed for unsigned code to run. This meant that anyone could develop their own eboot.bin executables and run them right from the PSP's memory card. And that's exactly what they did. This was the start of the homebrew revolution on the Sony PSP. When Sony launched the Japanese PSP, I had read about it in a magazine and I knew that the 1.0 firmware was able to run unsigned code, and I was very excited, so I wanted to get my hands on a Japanese PSP. So that's exactly what I did. I imported one directly from Japan. I was very intrigued about what NEM was doing with the Hello World program, and I wanted to get involved. So what did I do? I made a port of a very popular first-person shooter to the Sony PSP. Just like Hello World, every system needs Doom. I ported it early in 2005, and by that point, more and more homebrew started to appear, with Super Nintendo, PC Engine, Sega Genesis, and even Nintendo 64 emulators being developed. But not everyone had access to a 1.0 Japanese firmware PSP. When the PSP launched in North America in March of 2005, the launch systems were installed with firmware 1.5. The 1.0 eBoot method no longer worked, but it didn't take long for a new exploit to appear. Hackers found out you could still boot unsigned code by simply swapping memory cards at the launch of the game. This method was known as the swapsploit. This method was crude and didn't always work. You had to be quick. In June of 2005, the K-exploit was released. A simple misuse of the sprintf function in C allowed booting of unsigned code simply by using two folders named the exact same thing, but with one of them having a % after it. One folder contained the eBoot file, while the other contained the metadata. The 1.5 exploit became very popular. Once again, Sony quickly rolled out updates 1.51 and 1.52. Both of these disabled the K-exploit. But hackers didn't budge. They were happy enough with their 1.5 firmware PSP 1000s. During this time, the homebrew community was in full swing with the development of many console, computer, and arcade emulators. The original Xbox may have been the king of homebrew, but the Sony PSP had exploded. It was the handheld that everyone wanted. Sony knew that in order to get users off of 1.5, they had to offer up something big, and they did exactly that. The 2.0 update contained some exciting new features. It came with a built-in web browser, the ability to add wallpapers and play MPEG-4 AVC video files, as well as some other new features. For the most part, it worked. Many users upgraded to 2.0 and gave up on their unsigned code, but hackers were just getting started. Once Sony had released the 2.0 firmware, initially it had appeared as though they had successfully mitigated the damage, and anyone that wanted to run firmware 2.0 had to give up running unsigned code. But it wasn't long until the next round of exploits started to appear. The 2.0 update was released in June of 2005. 3 months went by without much activity, but in September a new buffer overrun exploit was found by launching a TIFF image file from the photo menu. The first proof of concept was released. It was once again Hello World. The TIFF exploit was also the basis of the MPH downgrader. A downgrader is a tool that would simply downgrade your 2.0 PSP back to 1.5. and you could do this as many times as you wanted. This was before the days of eFuses, so there was no danger to your system. This method was further refined by the eLoader, which allowed Homebrew to launch from a simple menu without the need to downgrade. eLoader also utilized the TIFF exploit. This did little to stop hackers, however. A new method of the same exploit was found and another downgrader to 1.5 was released. Sony was very quick to respond and released the 2.01 update that addressed the TIFF exploit. And by November of 2005, a save game buffer overflow exploit was found in the game Grand Theft Auto Liberty City Stories, allowing for unsigned code to run once again. And a Hello World program was used as a proof of concept. Sony was on high alert releasing updates to patch exploits as fast as they could, but ask anyone in software development what happens when you rush updates out too quick. Both the 2.5 and 2.6 firmware releases were susceptible to exploits to open up kernel mode, the keys to the mansion if you will. This exploit was once again made possible by Liberty City Stories save game overflow. Rockstar also got involved and removed all existing stock of Liberty City Stories from stores and shipped out an updated release that patched the exploit and came with a mandatory firmware update to 2.6, but Sony failed to fix the TIFF photo exploit correctly. In fact, from firmware 2.0 to 2.8, the exploit was always there. After Liberty City Stories was patched, hackers turned back to the TIFF exploit, and in December of 2006, a new method to open up kernel access in firmware 2.8 was discovered by Team C&D. For a short time, it seemed like eLoaders and save game exploits and downgrading to 1.5 was the only way to run homebrew and unsigned code on the PSP, but then out of nowhere, a hacker from Spain appeared onto the scene and his name was Dark Alex. The problem with the cat and mouse game between Sony and hackers was that for any new game that came out, and the PSP had some good ones, many of them needed mandatory updates to play. So you either stay on your homebrew enabled version and miss out on the new God of War game, or upgrade and lose unsigned code until a new exploit is found. Dark Alex released custom firmware which allowed all homebrew to run, but keeping all existing features of the current official firmware. His releases became a standard in the scene. Now, there was no longer a need to downgrade. The 3.50 firmware became a new standard in Homebrew. This went all the way up to firmware version 5. Around this time, Dark Alex suddenly stopped working on custom firmwares. There was rumors that Sony approached him and offered him cash. Other rumors was he was hired on by Sony to be a part of their security team. Both of these rumors were denied by Sony. Downgraders were also quite common for many of the early years of the PSP hacking scene. But by definition, there are some risks involved. Some so-called downgraders were actually Trojans that would brick your PSP, and in some instances, users wouldn't follow instructions. A failed upgrade to a custom firmware came with risks as well. During the days of 2.5 and 2.6 firmwares, mod chip manufacturers stepped in and started offering hardware solutions that contain multi-firmware and protection against bricking. A bricked PSP is a paperweight, and they were not recoverable. That is, up until 2007, when the Pandora's Battery mod was revealed. The Pandora's Battery was released by Team Noobs and was the killer app exploit for the PSP at the time. The mod came with a battery known as the Pandora's Battery, which would put the PSP into service mode. And with the magic memory stick, it could restore any brick PSP back from the grave. It could also install any firmware of any kind at any time. And it could not be patched by Sony using software. This was effectively a permanent solution for running homebrew on the PSP 1000. The discovery and reverse engineering of this exploit was so impressive that even Sony representatives stated that the Pandora's Battery will not harm the PSP, as it's exactly the same method that they used internally to repair systems. Team Noobs was one of the most famous hacking groups on the PSP, which also released the Illuminati exploit, a save game overflow found in the game Lumines, which caused the famous story of the game jumping almost 6,000% on sales in Amazon. After Dark Alex left the scene, new variants of exploits started to appear, including the half-byte loader and homebrew enablers, or HENs for short. These new exploits would also work on the PSP 3000 and PSP Go models, effectively allowing all PSP models to run unsigned code. Sony has always maintained that the reason why they were so aggressive with bringing out firmware updates was to curb the level of piracy that was happening on the PSP hacking scene. But by the same token, they've been quoted multiple times as saying that they have no issues with the homebrew community. In fact, they wanted to leverage the homebrew community in future revisions of Sony hardware. When asked about PSP homebrew, former president and CEO of Sony Computer Entertainment America, Jack Tretton, was quoted as saying, "I think that is something that is in the works. We certainly see some of the stuff that's being done via homebrew, and it's incredibly creative. And I think we'd like to try to tap into that a little bit more." Sony did offer Linux on the PlayStation 3 as a means for homebrew development, but it was famously removed in 2010. By 2012, a new player known as Team Pro started releasing their custom, or what they call aftermarket firmwares, which are 100% open source and developed by the community. The Pro firmware represents the final form of the PSP hacking story, with all the features you'd ever want, and one that's simple to install on any model PSP. The ultimate demise of the security of the PSP came from a simple Hello World program that started a revolution and the rise of homebrew. The scene was one of the most memorable in history, and if you've not yet experienced what a Sony PSP can do outside of play some great games, maybe it's time you take a look yourself. If there's one word to describe the Sega Saturn, it's complex. Everything about the system was complicated, over-engineered, and difficult. Horror stories from developers claiming that it was almost impossible to code on. Although the system featured dual CPUs, this would also be very complicated to develop for. Both CPUs were not equal. Instead, they would act as a master-slave and share the same bus. The graphical architecture for the Saturn would famously be designed initially with fast 2D in mind, but would pivot to include 3D graphics processing in the hardware, which would also include 2 separate frame buffers. Everything about the Saturn was complex, even down to the CD drive. While not the first time Sega utilized the optical disc format for its game system, which of course began with the Sega CD, the Saturn would be the first dedicated CD-based system from Sega. On the Sega CD, there would be no copy protection on the discs at all. That is, you could simply rip an original and make a copy on a blank CDR, and it would run just fine. Perhaps the aggressive timelines for the Sega CD's launch meant that Sega would not invest in any security. But it would be a different story for the Sega Saturn. Sega knew that leaving the system unprotected would result in massive amounts of piracy. CD burners were becoming cheaper and more sophisticated, and would become a normal part of any home PC. Sega knew that they had a problem on their hands, so they developed an anti-piracy measure that, like the system itself, would be complex and take many years to defeat. At a glance, the level of sophistication is not apparent. Each mastered Sega Saturn disc came pressed with copy protection data on the outer rings of the disc. If we take a closer look at the Saturn CD like this one here, the outer rings shows what is to be vertical indentations burnt onto the media, but this is actually one continuous section of data, or wobble data. This area is known as the ring area. The reason for this data pressed on the disc was simple. Conventional CD burners were not capable of burning this data, and the Saturn hardware will check for it to authenticate that the disc is original, then boot into the game. CD burners would become more sophisticated and capable of overburning, but as far as I'm aware, there was no drive on the market capable of replicating a Sega Saturn disc. Now you might be wondering about this protection data, as it does sound very familiar. Wobble data was also something that was found in the Saturn's biggest competitor, the Sony PlayStation, which handled protection in a very similar way. If the wobble data was not present or it could not be read, the game would not boot, but the PlayStation wobble data would be stored in the table of contents. A Sega Saturn CD has protection data stored in the ring area outside of the table of contents, which means that there is custom hardware that handles this check known as the Saturn CDB or CD block. And as is the case with the majority of the Sega Saturn, this is custom hardware made up of a combination of a CD subsystem controller and a SH1 microprocessor. The CDB manages both CD-IO as well as authentication. Circumventing the copy protection of the CDB would be extremely difficult but not impossible. The obvious first step is the good old swap trick. Made famous on the Sony PlayStation, it was possible to utilize the same method on the Sega Saturn. By inserting an original disc and allowing the CDB to authenticate against the ring area, then quickly swapping in a copy disc, it was possible to boot backup games. In fact, swap tricks were a fairly common practice when it comes to the Saturn. But of course, there are risks associated with this method, specifically around reducing the life of the CD drive motor. It also wouldn't be long before mod chips would arrive on the hardware. These would be much more complex than the Sony PlayStation chips. Saturn mod chips would effectively act as a man in the middle between the CD drive and the rest of the hardware. When the Saturn powers on and a disc is inserted, the CDB attempts to seek out data that's located in the ring area. The mod chip then intercepts and feeds back the same response data that the CD would provide. Then data is read from different areas in the ring data. So effectively, the mod chip must supply fake data to circumvent the protection. To add further complexity, the timing of these checks are crucial, and any data requests that fall outside of a very small timing window will simply fail. Sega Saturn mod chips worked fine, but they did not defeat the CDB and the disc ring area protection. It just circumvented it. Furthermore, there were many iterations of the Sega Saturn hardware, which meant producing different mod chips would be tedious because due to the nature of the chip, they would often break down over time. And on top of this, CD lasers sometimes would have a hard time reading CDRs. So it didn't always matter if you had the best mod chip on the market. If your CD laser didn't play nice with CDRs, you would have a lot of trouble booting into backup games. There were other methods to boot backup discs, notably utilizing a flashed action replay cartridge that, when combined with a swap trick, could boot into backups on any subsequent reset of the console. And in 2001, there was a discovery made when a Saturn owner came into possession of a CD that would be used internally by Sega to boot backup discs after an original Saturn key disc was used. The key disc contained the outside ring area and boot as normal, but would also enable the ability to boot CDRs. This disc would be known as the Saturn disc. The disc was unique that it contained the string Sega system in the main header, and essentially would disable any further security checks. This particular disc was used by Sega internal testers to test their software on retail hardware before the game would go gold. Now, thanks to modern FPGA technology, the once complicated mod chips now have been replaced by optical drive emulation, which essentially do the same things as a mod chip device does, albeit allows you to run images installed onto an SD card or a SSD in the case of the Terra Onion mode, and gives you a much easier and cleaner experience overall with less points of failure. In recent times, mod chips have been replaced with optical drive emulators, which, as the name suggests, emulates the Saturn optical drive but utilizes storage media such as an SD card, or in the case of the Terra Onion mode, solid-state drives, the Saturn's copy protection in the same way that a mod chip does, by simply emulating the seeks and reads to the ring area to bypass the protection. Optical drive emulators, or ODEs, have the huge advantage that they completely replace the CD drive, and of course won't have any trouble reading discs or burning your drive motor out. But at the end of the day, they are just a more modern take on the traditional Saturn mod chip. But despite this, the Saturn's DRM surrounding the CD block and the ring area protection has held firm. Now, I do think it's a little misleading to suggest that the Saturn has extremely good security. It certainly had a lot more sophistication over something like the Sony PlayStation, but you have to remember that there were a lot less people involved in the Saturn community at the time, and hence there wasn't as much motivation to attempt to defeat its security. But ultimately, there would be some really impressive advancements in the Sega Saturn community, and none better than the video CD exploit, which ultimately allowed injected code to run and tap into the CDB block. The CDB was a black box that seemed like there would never be any simple way to run any custom code on it at all. That is, until 2016, when Dr. Abrasive discovered a sophisticated method of injecting code from the video CD add-on port to the CDB. His method meant that he would have full control over the CDB for homebrew purposes, but also for allowing custom CDB code meant that his method, utilizing the video CD mod, is far less intrusive than optical drive emulators. It keeps the CD drive intact, but complements this by the installation of his device in the video CD port, and allows for games to boot off USB media as well. And ultimately, this is where things are today. Yes, the Sega Saturn has well and truly had its security defeated, but it took many years. With its overall complexity and far less user base, meant that perhaps many users were not as interested in defeating security on the Saturn as the Sony PlayStation. The Sony PlayStation Vita is an amazing handheld. Not only its impressive lineup of games, but it also boasts some excellent hardware and features which pioneered handheld gaming as we know it today. The Vita was officially discontinued by Sony in 2019. However, there is a very strong community still making games for it, both commercially on the PlayStation Store, which is still running as of the making of this episode, but also, and more importantly, its homebrew community, with some really amazing works that keep coming out. Games ported over from Android, such as GTA San Andreas, Bully, and even Battlefield Bad Company 2, and there are others that are being developed. While Sony left the Vita to die, security researchers ensured that it would live on. It's really easy to exploit a Vita these days, and you can run these exploits on any revision of the Vita hardware, including the PlayStation TV, with any firmware in a matter of minutes. But how was the Vita's security defeated? It's easy to assume that it was just an update from the original PSP, but things weren't that simple. In fact, the path to exploiting and defeating security on the Vita would be quite complex, and for years it was thought that maybe it would never be hacked. Compared to the PSP, which has a rich history of exploits over its lifespan, this time around, Sony did their homework. Noting the failure of both the PSP and PS3 security systems, they would double down on the architecture to ensure the same mistakes were not made. To put it simply, the Sony PlayStation Vita had the most sophisticated security mechanism that was ever developed by Sony at the time. So what ended up going wrong? The PlayStation Vita was originally released in 2012, and it was a significant update from the earlier PSP. It featured a quad-core ARM Cortex-A9 CPU, quad-core GPU, the PowerVR SGX 543, with 512MB of memory on board and 128MB of VRAM. It would also feature a 5-inch OLED display with touch capabilities, both front and rear cameras, stereo sound, a rear touchpad, as well as 6-axis motion sensing and a battery life of 3 to 5 hours while in-game. If we take a look at the Vita's motherboard, the first clue that Sony really beefed up security would be the main SoC, the CXD531-5G. This single SoC embeds the CPU, GPU, DRAM, VRAM, I/O, and a custom security processor all in one chip. Because the DRAM is embedded, this means that traditional memory dumping techniques would be off the table. Compare that to the PSP, where the first 1.0 version ran unsigned code out of the box and its firmware kernel was all unencrypted. It was very quickly determined that the Vita would pose more of a significant challenge. But of course, where there is a will, there is a way, and the first obvious attack vector would be the PSP emulator that runs on the Vita. As we know, the PlayStation Vita is fully backward compatible with the PSP, but it's entirely running in a sandbox, completely isolated. The earliest Vita exploit was in 2012 and based on the older PSP hack that was known as the half-byte loader. By effectively running the same exploit on the Vita with a PSP game that's vulnerable to the exploits such as Super Collapse 3, it allows unsigned code execution inside the PSP emulator. A good first start perhaps, but extremely limited. It would also be very easy for Sony just to pull any game that was vulnerable to this exploit off the PlayStation Store and effectively shut off the supply. What made the Vita difficult to exploit in the early days was for the most part that the system was a black box. Everything important was embedded in the SoC, all data was encrypted, there was no way of dumping the contents of memory, and there was no way to exploit the hardware via USB. Sony did their homework, and any exploit found would take some sophistication. With the launch of the Vita, Sony would be exploring the mobile space and looking to gain a market share. Then President and CEO Kaz Hirai wanted to bring Vita games to smartphones and other devices. And around April of 2012, Sony would announce PlayStation Mobile. This would offer developers a free SDK, which would allow them to create apps and games for the Vita and other PlayStation certified devices, such as the Xperia line of smartphones. Developers would only need to pay a $99 per year contract, and it would allow them to sell their games on the PlayStation Store. A wholly owned platform built on the company's strengths in gaming could provide a key differentiator as Sony would expand its mobile operations. This initiative ultimately did roll out, but was eventually shuttered in 2015. PlayStation Mobile, or PSM, would also run in a walled-off sandbox, but it ran within the confines of the Vita rather than the PSP emulator. So this would be a good pathway to find an exploit, or at the very least attempting to dump the Vita's memory. Security researcher Yifan Liu would go about exploiting the Vita by the way of PSM and the framework that it uses known as Mono. Mono is effectively an open source .NET framework that can be ported and run on many different platforms. This makes it possible to run .NET C# applications on many other devices, for example. Since Mono was open source, Yifan Liu would browse the Mono source code and look for code that could be exploitable. Once one was found, he would develop a tool that would dump the PS Vita's RAM, a very vital first step. But the second would be the breakthrough that was the first blow to the Vita's security system. The Mono C# compiler uses just-in-time compilation to ARM native code. This means that PSM must have some memory that allows for code execution. After many attempts of trial and error and pushing payloads into memory, Yifan Liu was able to run native unsigned code on the Vita. Based on these discoveries, a tool known as the UV loader or the Userland Vita loader was developed, and this would be the first working native code homebrew all the way back in 2012. But unfortunately, because there was no open source homebrew SDK for the PlayStation Vita at the time, the UV loader did not get the response that was anticipated. And unfortunately, because Yifan released the source code, Sony would then look at the source code to secure their system in later updates and make the user mode code much more harder to break. Now it's worth mentioning, while all this was happening behind the scenes, Yifan and other security researchers, who would later be known as Team Molecule, would continue to focus their attention on the Vita, making discoveries on both the hardware and software side, and these discoveries would become very important later on. It was 2015 when the Vita finally saw a new userland exploit known as Rejuvenate. It was an iteration of the earlier PSM and UV loader work that ran native Vita homebrew once again, but this time it required a PlayStation Mobile development assistant to run. Sony had announced that in 2015 they were ending the PSM service, so Yifan Liu would release the exploit to the public, and this was the real first step into the world of homebrew on the Vita for many, but it had its limitations. The exploit required tethering to a PC, a Windows PC to be specific for PSM, and a USB connection. But again, without homebrew support, there would be not much interest. Fortunately, this time around, the first versions of the PS Vita open source SDK would be released, resulting in some early emulators and homebrew for the system. Rejuvenate worked, but it wasn't user-friendly and had many limitations, and many believed that this is where the end of the road would be for the Vita. But in August of 2016, Yifan Liu and Team Molecule would release Henkaku, an easy-to-use homebrew solution that ran on any 3.60 firmware PlayStation Vita, including the PSTV. Henkaku was much more user-friendly than anything else before it. It allows for homebrew packages to be installed in the Vita's live area and installs a tool known as Molecular Shell that offers a file system that opens up an FTP server, USB connectivity, and allowing for the installation of any homebrew packages or VPK files. Henkaku would be the first kernel exploit for the Vita. It took advantage of known vulnerabilities that the team was aware of going all the way back to 2014. After the public release of Henkaku, Sony would quickly patch these in 3.61 and fix the exploit, and for a while, a 3.60 firmware Vita was what you needed to run homebrew. Around the same time, Team Molecule had announced that their work on the Vita was completed and they were stepping away from the scene. Many believed that this is the end of the story, but security researcher The Flow would pick up from where the team left off. First, by porting Henkaku to 3.65, and then offering H-Encore that worked on any capable 3.65 to 3.68 PlayStation Vita. And once again, it was thought that a 3.68 firmware PlayStation Vita would be the final version that was exploitable. But The Flow had other ideas, releasing H-Encore 2, that is a fully chained kernel exploit for all Vitas up to the most current firmware, 3.73. During the development of H-Encore and H-Encore 2, The Flow would also develop many other useful tools and applications, such as Adrenaline, which is the PSP emulator that uses a custom 6.61 PSP firmware for playing old PSP games and homebrew with zero fuss, or Madoru, that allows you to downgrade a Vita's firmware back to 3.60 or 3.65 and install Enso, a custom firmware for the Vita that leaves it permanently hacked. Henkaku and H-Encore are homebrew enablers, which means that a tool needs to be run on each reboot of the PlayStation Vita to run unsigned code. With the launch of Henkaku in 2016, and all the work that was done by The Flow to bring homebrew enablers to any PS Vita firmware, it was the spark that needed to attract many homebrew developers to the Vita and bring their emulators, applications, and homebrew ports across. There were many amazing ones, and we've covered these on the channel before. They say that the Vita means life, and the community has single-handedly kept the Vita alive, thanks to the many years of hard work from security researchers who loved the hardware. It's thanks to them that the Vita and its games can be preserved forever. As for me, I still love the Vita in 2022. It's an incredible handheld, and I think there's still lots of life left in the hardware for many years to come. After the swift and successful exploitation of the original Xbox in 2002, Microsoft went back to the drawing board and invested heavily in securing the new generation. The Xbox 360 was designed to be totally secure with multiple levels of checks to stop unauthorized code and tampering. This was managed by the Hypervisor, the gatekeeper of all things security on the Xbox 360. Like the original Xbox, the Hypervisor only allows for signed code, and modifying any parts of code or data will not allow any game to run. Unlike the original Xbox, however, no encrypted executable code is ever written to memory. This means no code injection or snooping of memory was ever possible. And if there was somehow a method to bypass either of these checks, the PowerPC-based Xenon CPU that powered the Xbox 360 implemented eFuse technology. Its purpose was simple: to prevent from downgrading. If Microsoft was made aware of any potential exploits to circumvent unsigned code, they'd simply push out a firmware update via Xbox Live and blow an eFuse in the CPU, which meant there would be no way to ever go back to an exploitable firmware revision. There's even a specific API call in the Xbox 360's kernel to blow an eFuse. Each Xenon CPU was uniquely signed with its own key, so there was no easy way of just replacing the CPU either. These barriers made it difficult for a known exploit to be released, as it was simply patched. In 2005, Chris Satchell, who was part of the Xbox Advanced Technology Group, said to the BBC, "There are going to be levels of security in this box that the hacker community has never seen before. We've taken security to the hardware level and built it from the ground up." With these discoveries quickly identified in 2005 after the launch of the Xbox 360, hackers knew that they had a huge challenge ahead of them. But like the original Xbox, many different teams worked to exploit many different areas of the system. If we go back to the days of the original Xbox, the system was quickly exploited first via hard modding techniques, mod chips like the Executor 2 and 3 chips, and then later on with soft modding techniques like the 007 Agent Under Fire and MechAssault save game exploits. But on the Xbox 360, things were a little different. The first area that got the attention of hackers was the DVD drive. The original Xbox and Xbox 360 DVDs share many similarities, with the Xbox 360 originally utilizing the XGD2 format, which was designed for the Xbox 360, but based on the original XGD1 format of the Xbox. It was possible to easily rip both Xbox and Xbox 360 discs with a single modified firmware on a PC without too much trouble. Hackers started to take a look at the Xbox 360's DVD drive very closely, perhaps because the original Xbox DVD drive wasn't a main target and generally left alone once the unsigned code exploits were discovered. It was theorized that Microsoft may have overlooked it when considering the security on the Xbox 360 as well. And in December of 2005, a hacker known as The Specialist posed a question to the Xbox hacking community. I was just wondering, wouldn't it be possible to hack the firmware of the DVD-ROM drive so it could play backups? I mean, the 360 will execute a signed game executable only if only it's loaded from secure media. Wouldn't it be possible to hack the firmware in such a way that it would always report the media type as secure medium, so that the 360 would think an original DVD was inserted? This was an interesting question. The Hypervisor would not likely be overseeing the DVD internals and its RAM, and probably would have no way of detecting a custom DVD firmware at all. The Specialist went to work to test his theory out, and after a few months of research, development, failure, and ultimately success, and with the help of others, he was able to flash a custom firmware onto his Xbox 360 with a now infamous video of a backup of Project Gotham 3 Racing being inserted into an Xbox 360 and booting up. This research started out by exploiting original Xbox DVD drives to read Xbox 360 discs and backup discs. This proved successful without too much trouble, then shifted focus on getting Xbox 360 drives working under Windows. This was trickier, with many challenge response checks in place. The Specialist released a small unlock program that allowed the original Xbox 360 drive, the Hitachi GDR3120L, to unlock under Windows and its contents read and dumped. But his theory proved to be correct. By March of 2006, his video and discovery proved a custom firmware could indeed boot backups. On the Xbox 360, a modified custom DVD firmware works something like this. An Xbox 360 executable has an extension .xex, and these of course are digitally signed. As part of this, the xex has information about the disk type. Therefore, any attempt to modify the xex media bits to allow for a DVD-R would fail as the signature is changed and would prevent the disk from booting. A custom firmware simply keeps the contents of the disk intact, but during the challenge response authentication checks, returns a valid secure Xbox 360 disk. So to be perfectly clear, this method only allowed for game backups and software piracy. It did not allow for the ability to run unsigned code or homebrew, and therefore there was no way you could run something like Linux via this particular method. And for this reason, the Specialist decided to not release his firmware to the public. Microsoft, as you can imagine, were not pleased, and they were quick to respond and let everyone know that their security was still not hacked, except it was, albeit in a manner that they had not expected. A spokesman from Microsoft said, "The core security system has not been broken. However, it's reported that the authentication protocol between the optical disk drive and the console may be attacked, which if accurate could allow people to play illegally copied games. Our security team is aware of this, and we are investigating potential solutions to this issue. The Xbox 360 platform was designed to be updated, and we are prepared to respond appropriately should any unauthorized activity be identified." The Specialist decided to keep his firmware private and not release it, but his information and discovery was documented on popular forum at the time, xboxhacker.net. And at the same time as this, another hacker known as Commodore Forever was also working on custom DVD firmwares. The Xbox 360 would launch with two variations of DVD drive, the Toshiba TSH943 and the Hitachi GDR3120L. In May of 2006, Commodore Forever released his very first firmware for the Toshiba drive and quickly followed it up with the firmware for the Hitachi drive. These firmwares played all backup Xbox 360 and backup Xbox original discs via backward compatibility. In order to install an extreme custom firmware, you first need to extract the existing firmware. The reason for this is that the commands that are sent to the DVD from the Xbox 360 CPU are encrypted, and the key is necessary to inject into the custom firmware, otherwise the drive will not be read. The DVD drive also needs to be set into debug mode. This opened up the drive for writing the new firmware, and it didn't take long for mod chip manufacturers like Team Executor to provide easy hardware and software tools to both extract and flash a DVD drive with a custom firmware. Microsoft was quick to respond to this, and by October of 2006 they began to bring out new revisions of both DVD drives to mitigate the situation. They began by first replacing the flash chip with a new type so it wasn't easily extractable, and removed the debug trigger to get access to the debug mode, or Mode B as it's known. They also covered previously extractable flash chips with resin, making it extremely difficult to read the contents of the flash. But these did not help. Commodore Forever released updated firmwares for the drive revisions, hardware makers were selling better tools and software, and things were getting easier and more streamlined to flash any DVD drive. Microsoft knew they had a huge problem on their hands. So the question now becomes, how does Microsoft detect a backup copy of this disc and not an original if the backup copy is an exact replica of an original Xbox 360 game disc? In May of 2007, with the spring update coinciding with the Halo 3 beta, reports began emerging that users were being banned from Xbox Live, suddenly being disconnected, and an inability to reconnect. In fact, Microsoft began banning consoles in retaliation to the modified firmware usage. This was the first of what was known as ban waves, with Microsoft reminding people that by logging onto Xbox Live with a modified DVD drive and a backup disc, that their consoles would be banned. It was easy for Microsoft to send challenges and commands to the DVD in order to ensure everything was legitimate. If you look at an Xbox 360 game disc, it has some important areas other than the game data itself. The security sectors, which is a small block of bytes, is used to authenticate the game disc. The disc manufacturing information, or DMI, which, like the name suggests, contains information about the disc manufacturer, company names, and batch ID information. The physical format information, or PFI, is information about where the physical sectors begin and end, and the video partition, just like on an original Xbox disc, is the partition that is read when you insert an Xbox 360 disc into a PC. Microsoft added checks to ensure all of these areas matched exactly what was expected by simple CRC checks to see if there were any differences found, and it would flag the console to be banned if there was. But it wasn't long before hackers figured out this approach and came up with the concept of stealth media. Stealth media is all about making a backup disc appear to the Xbox 360 host exactly the same as an original. Although this was already done with the security sector and its challenge response, the extra checks for the DMI, PFI, and the checksums of the XEX and other relevant information, and ensuring that the video partition was present and an exact replica of an original disc, meant that it should have been undetectable by Microsoft. Tools such as the Xbox Backup Creator would perform stealth checks to determine if your backup copy would be safe from any possible bans. Commodore Forever released updated firmwares known as iXtreme, which had stealth media checks once again, allowing backups to pass banning checks on Xbox Live. In the short term, the cat and mouse game with Microsoft continued on, but a second ban wave hit in 2008, this time with the massive launch of Gears of War 2. Additional updates to the firmware started to include jitter detection. This emulated the randomization or slight movements to emulate an actual physical drive. In 2009, once again, Microsoft launched a massive ban wave with Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, but Commodore Forever kept bringing updates out, tweaking his firmwares and adding new checks all the time. Microsoft released newer Xbox revisions with BenQ and Lite on drives, and the iXtreme Light Touch firmware was released for these. In 2011, Microsoft rolled out a system update that coincided with the launch of the Kinect, which contained an anti-piracy measure known as AP25. It was unique to each console, and it would not allow any AP25 enabled games to boot if detected. Once again, Commodore Forever defeated this check in all firmwares, and again Microsoft rolled out a new ban wave during the holiday season. XGD3 was the last major revision of the Xbox 360 game disc. It added additional content integrity checks and changed the physical format of the disc, resizing the partitions to allow a dual layer format of 8.5 gigabytes. This meant that it would be difficult to burn disc images because these new partitions were outside the size capacity. Existing Xbox 360s could not read XGD3 discs without an update to the firmware, and any attempt to read an XGD3 disc with a custom firmware would flag the console to be banned. Commodore Forever released the iXtreme LT 2.0 firmware that defeated XGD3 and allowed methods to burn backups on regular DVD dual-layer discs without any modifications. For 7 years, Commodore Forever released firmware updates one after the other, finally sounding off after the iXtreme LT Ultimate in 2013, staying one step ahead of Microsoft by continuing to enhance and revise features of its firmwares to correctly respond to any challenges sent down to the DVD firmware via the CPU. But drive firmware hacks were plain and simple, used for piracy and backups. The hypervisor and the security system of the Xbox 360 was left intact. Homebrew was not an option. But as we will see in part 2, there was another group of individuals that discovered a critical flaw in the system management controller that opened up the Xbox 360 to the world of homebrew and unsigned code. That infamous quote was made by Chris Satchell, who was working for the Xbox Advanced Technology Group in 2005. In part 1 of this series, we covered the Xbox 360 and how the DVD drive was targeted by hackers with custom firmware code that exploited the drive to run backup games. While this method proved to be very popular, it did not open up the system for homebrew, which is what thrived on the original Xbox for many years before. The DVD exploits, as clever as they were, only allowed for piracy, which meant that there was no ability for the homebrew or Linux community to take advantage of the system. If we compare the Sony PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, both share similar specifications. But the PlayStation 3 came out of the box with a Linux distribution, a sandbox for the development of homebrew called OtherOS. The Xbox 360, on the other hand, had nothing for the bedroom coder to play around in. Microsoft had promised the homebrew community to open up the Xbox 360 to allow for the development of homebrew, but this ended up in the form of XNA Game Studio Express. In 2006 at the launch, Peter Moore, then Vice President of Xbox, said, "XNA Game Studio Express is our first step of creating a YouTube for video games. It will give you everything you need to bring your games to life on the Xbox 360. XNA Game Studio Express was a welcome addition to the Xbox 360, but it wasn't what the homebrew community was looking for. It's essentially a framework of portable libraries that require C#.NET that allowed you to build games on Windows and run them on the Xbox 360 or Windows phones. It only allowed restricted access to the hardware, and while there were some really cool games developed for it, some of which have become successful such as Bastion and Dust: The Elysian Tale, it also required a $99 membership fee per year, and it certainly would not allow you to run Linux. OtherOS on the PlayStation 3 came with the console and was free of charge. The Xbox 360 was several times more powerful than the original Xbox, and came with 8 times the amount of RAM. This meant that it should make for a significantly better homebrew device for media players, emulation, and homebrew games. Many of us from the OG Xbox days, if you were around in those days, wanted to see homebrew on the Xbox 360 as the natural progression of things. But it was clear that Microsoft had invested so much time and money into the security system of the Xbox 360 that it wasn't going to be easy. And we found out very quickly that things were going to take a lot longer than anticipated. Given this, the motivation to exploit the Xbox 360 was high. There must have been a way. But Microsoft had spent millions securing the hardware. Here's a quick summary. The boot process of the Xbox 360 has a secure chain of trust, and this time, all of it is contained inside the physical CPU itself. Unlike the original Xbox, where it was possible to snoop data along the bus, nothing is sent over the bus at all. Furthermore, the Xenon CPU contains a unique key that's tied to the console itself, as well as eFuses, which would enforce updates by blowing a fuse, and this meant that you could never downgrade back to a previous version. The Xbox 360 Hypervisor sits in RAM, and it's only 128KB in size. It will only ever allow for signed code executables to run, signed that is, with Microsoft's private key. All runtime memory is encrypted, and there's no way to alter RAM, and there's certainly no way to execute it. But if you can somehow get access to the Hypervisor, you can have full control of the machine. With current gen gaming, it's hard to believe anymore, but the Xbox 360 had 18 games at launch. Some were cross-gen titles with the original Xbox, others were sequels to popular franchises, and some were new IP. One game in the launch lineup that was popular was Peter Jackson's King Kong. It was a fun first-person adventure title and easy achievement points. It was worth a playthrough just for that. Although the Xbox 360 game executables are signed, game assets such as level data, textures, models, audio, and shaders are not. This meant that a game that may have had an exploitable asset may open up the door for code execution on the system. But even if you did have an exploitable asset on the game, wouldn't the Hypervisor shut it down anyway? Well, yes and no. Microsoft shipped the Xbox 360 in November of 2005, but in October of 2006 with the version update 4532, a bug was introduced that would allow for complete system control. How did this happen? One of the main tasks of the Hypervisor is to handle all system calls, in other words, calls to kernel mode functions. In the update 4532, an exploit was found that would make it possible for the Hypervisor to system call into user memory and execute code. This is what was known as the King Kong exploit. The exploitable shader on the game was patched to load arbitrary code with full privileges and access to hardware. But if you had to modify a shader on the game disk to launch unsigned code, that would mean that you would need to use a backup copy of the game, which would not boot on a retail Xbox 360. But there is a simple workaround to this. A hacked DVD firmware that boots backups would easily handle this. The King Kong exploit was developed in November of 2006 but was not disclosed publicly until February of 2007. Microsoft had already been made aware of the exploit and it was patched even before it was announced to the public. And because of eFuse technology, there was no way to go back to this firmware after you had updated. The King Kong glitch was a good first step, but it was discovered too late. All was not lost, however. In fact, far from it. One of the chips in the Xbox 360 is known as the SMC or System Management Controller. This is a fairly common chip with most home computers. It controls all the power functions, controls the fans, handles system resets and various other commands. The Xbox 360 also had a JTAG port for the GPU and CPU. JTAG is an interface that's used for programming and debugging, but for security reasons, both the GPU and CPU JTAG ports are very quickly disabled during the boot sequence. But if we draw our attention back to the SMC, it's possible to override this disabling of the JTAG ports and apply a timing hack to bypass the eFuses and load kernel 5532, the same kernel as used by the King Kong exploits as before, but without requiring the original game disk. This was all done before the bootloader could shut down the JTAG port. This process would normally make the GPU become unstable, so as part of this process, the system is soft rebooted. From here, the system boots up to a patched kernel and hypervisor, which enables the use of homebrew. To explain how this timing attack works in more detail, the base kernel comes shipped with all Xbox 360s and is always present. When a firmware update is applied, it's essentially appended onto the base kernel rather than overwritten. This is likely for security reasons. To deal with the problem of not being able to downgrade to 4532 due to burnt eFuses, if the Xbox 360 CPU key is known, then it can easily bypass this check. This timing exploit works by extracting the base kernel and patching it with the current firmware. This would still not boot because the system would show the current version. The firmware is checked against what's known as a lockdown counter, a check to determine the number of eFuses that are still available. This corresponds to the kernel version. This value is encrypted, but it's only 16 bytes long. Therefore, to determine a hash lockout counter value that matches the base kernel's only requires 4096 tries to decrypt the hash and allow this modified kernel to boot. Custom hardware was designed and in conjunction with the SMC enabling the GPU and CPU JTAG ports would open up the King Kong exploit once again without requiring the game or the shader as from before. This exploit is known as the JTAG hack. It rendered all Xbox 360s before December 2007's update to be vulnerable. But around the same time, Microsoft updated the hardware with the Zephyr, Opus, and then Jasper models. All of these were patched against the timing hack. In early 2008, Microsoft had completely patched the JTAG exploit. If you had a JTAGable Xbox 360, you were in luck. But only a very small group of users compared to the entire user base were using JTAG Xbox 360s. It was also much harder for the average user to mod their Xbox 360s as it required multiple steps and more chances of failure. Coupled with the red ring of death issues, it meant that many users chose to keep away. After Microsoft fixed the JTAG exploit, it seemed as if that was it. No more hacks. A few false starts, but Microsoft seemingly had won the battle. However, in August of 2011, a new exploit appeared out of nowhere. This time, it was a brute force attack on the CPU's thread management code, which is stored in the CPU itself. The exploit works by first setting the Xenon CPU's clock speed to the lowest possible so that it would still run signed code. This was performed by the scaler chip, known as the HANA, which has the CPU speed control built into the chip itself. Now, in this scenario, the Xbox 360 would normally think that there was a problem, and after 3 attempts to boot into the kernel, it would shut itself down. But the exploit allows the system to retry as many times as needed. The CPU has a reset test point, which is then used to quickly reset the processor, and this is where the exploit comes in. Like any CPU, when it's executing code, it's running an active thread. But by adjusting the timing to reset the CPU every 100 nanoseconds, on successful reset the active thread and registers are cleared out, and when the thread is dropped, the system perceives this as a successful status check and then proceeds to run modified code and take over the system and ultimately gain hypervisor access. Known as the RGH or reset glitch hack, it breathed new life into the Xbox 360 homebrew scene and worked on all model Xbox 360s except for the older Xenon models. The RGH method, however, is not perfect. The main issue is that it's slow, and in some instances there is a significant wait time for the Xbox 360 to glitch. Sometimes it never happens at all, and you must power off and try again. The RGH method was refined into the RJTAG method, which takes the same JTAG bootloaders from the King Kong days and combines it with the CPU thread drop exploit and use more sophisticated FPGA hardware to manage the exploit itself. And as of the making of this episode, the RJTAG method is still unpatched. Now, I do want to mention there are other exploit methods that came out after the reset glitch hack, including the RJTAG that we touched on. In general, they're just iterations or tweaks or little differences of the original exploit discoveries themselves. There's really nothing new that has been discovered since the reset glitch hack itself, and I don't anticipate that that will change in the future, considering that the Xbox 360 is all but a dead system in 2019. The reset glitch hack ultimately brought homebrew to all. No longer did you need to resort to using an older JTAGed Xbox 360, which had elevated risks of red ring of death. The developer of the RGH, known as Gleekly, also worked on open source ports that ran under Linux, known as libxenon. From here, work was done on bringing Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast emulation across to the Xbox 360. As for the homebrew scene itself, it wasn't as prominent as the original Xbox days, but there were still some great things to play. In 2009, 3 years had passed after the launch of the Sony PlayStation 3 when renowned security researcher George Hotz, or GeoHot, announced on his blog that he was attempting to hack the PlayStation 3. Up until that point, the PlayStation 3 had not been breached, and its security was heralded as the best ever designed in a console implementation, compared to the Xbox 360, which had already been exploited first with DVD firmware hacks and then later a hypervisor attack utilizing the JTAG port. The PlayStation 3 stood firm. But GeoHot made Sony nervous. His blog post went into detail discussing the method to attack the hypervisor, and his way in was to use Other OS, a feature on the PlayStation 3 that enabled the installation of Linux distributions. Yellow Dog Linux was a popular distribution for the system, and with a mouse and keyboard, Other OS could turn the PlayStation 3 into an everyday home computer. GeoHot published his findings on his blog and even the theoretical methods of exploiting the system. Sony started to panic and wondered what if. What if some exploit was left wide open in other OS that compromised the hypervisor? And on April 1st, 2010, Sony released firmware 3.21. Their response was to completely remove other OS from the firmware, in effect, disable Linux from ever running on the PlayStation 3 again. The next system software update for the PlayStation 3 will be released on April 1st, 2010 and will disable the Install Other OS feature that was available on the PS3 systems prior to the current slimmer models. This feature enabled users to install an operating system, but due to security concerns, Sony Computer Entertainment will remove this functionality through the 3.21 system software update. The response to this was one of disbelief and anger. The Sony PlayStation 3 was advertised to run Linux, and to take that away was a red flag, and it was the motivation needed to begin targeted hacking attempts on the PlayStation 3. On top of this, a class action lawsuit against Sony and its removal of other OS was formed, and other OS removal cost Sony millions of dollars in settlement checks that are still being paid out today. After Sony had removed other OS in April, there was a consolidated effort of groups of different individuals that were rallying around to come up with ways to defeat security on the PlayStation 3. In short, people were unhappy about the removal and they wanted to get back at Sony in different ways. In August of 2010, from out of nowhere, a mod device known as the PS Jailbreak was announced that would allow for homebrew and game backups to run. This jailbreak device was nothing more than a simple USB stick and did not require any soldering or modification at all, and it worked on all PlayStation 3s at the time. People were skeptical. The PlayStation 3 remained hack-proof for years, and Sony had thought that they had closed every possible security hole with the removal of other OS. But when the device released, it was true. The PS Jailbreak worked. The company that designed the jailbreak never made themselves known for obvious reasons, but they knew that they had something special. It was accessible to all users, and it was simple to use, and they had charged $120 for the privilege of owning one. As it turns out, the PS Jailbreak was a real thing, and did everything as advertised. The question is, how does it work? So to answer this, we need to understand a couple of things. First, let's do a quick crash course in USB devices. A USB device, like a flash drive, contains information that lets the host know, in this instance the PlayStation 3, what the device is, who makes it, what version of USB it uses, how it can be configured, its endpoints and more. This information is known as the USB descriptors, and this is a standard across every single USB device. Every single USB device contains one device descriptor but multiple configuration, interface and endpoint descriptors. So if we consider a typical mass storage device like a flash drive, it would contain a single configuration descriptor that had an interface type of mass storage and two endpoint descriptors, one for receiving data and the other for sending data. But something like a USB hub would contain more descriptors. A 4-port USB hub would contain 4 device and 4 configuration descriptors. Furthermore, each USB device is identified by a 2-byte vendor code and a 2-byte product ID. These codes are assigned by the USB consortium group and the manufacturer. For example, this Logitech mouse that I use on my PC, the vendor code is 046D and the device ID is C083. If we look these up in a database, you can see that it returns the G403 Prodigy Gaming Mouse. So why is this important? It's because when Sony received defective PS3s, they would sometimes use a USB device known as a service mode jig. This would be connected to the USB port on the PS3 and it would put the system into factory service mode. From here, different things could be performed on the PS3, including rebuilding the hard drive and also downgrading the firmware. Information about factory service mode was discovered and leaked early in 2008, and with this information in hand, a group such as the PS Jailbreak team would be able to figure out a way to replicate the jig. But Sony knew that information on the jig would eventually be discovered, and one approach might be to replicate the jig by effectively replicating the USB device and configuration descriptors to match an official PS3 service mode jig and match the device and manufacturer IDs, so they added security around this, and it worked. However, when PS3 Jailbreak was released in August of 2010, two things happened. The first is, when everyone thought it was fake, it actually worked. And 2, it did not boot into factory service mode, it booted into a retail PS3, but from here you could run homebrew and play games from a USB device or installed directly onto the PlayStation 3's hard disk. Now, because the PS jailbreak was the first method out there and they tried to hide their tracks so that no one else could really replicate what they were doing, they ended up charging a lot of money for the privilege. And I saw prices anywhere from $120 to $150 depending on which reseller you had purchased it from. And this really upset a lot of people, especially those that wanted to do this system mod themselves, but they didn't want to pay for the privilege of doing so. So in the end, there was a fairly big group of people that ended up reverse engineering the PS jailbreak, understanding the control between the PS3 and the USB device, understanding how the flow worked and the exploit, and ended up replicating it and making it open source for anyone to either do it themselves for free or buy a cheap solution like a Teensy or an Arduino style device in order to replicate the exact control flow between the PS Jig and the PlayStation 3. So how does the PS jailbreak work? When you connect the device to the USB port, its device descriptor tells the PS3 that it's actually a 6-port USB hub. Now, of course, this is fake. After the hub is initialized, the PS jailbreak informs the PS3 a device has been plugged into fake port 1. Port 1 also contains the payload data of the exploit that will jump into after gaining control. So after reading port 1, it then tells the PS3 a device has been plugged into port 2, and then tells the PS3 that a device has been plugged into fake port 3, which also contains an unusually large descriptor. It then disconnects the device in port 2. This is important because the memory that was used to allocate the descriptors for port 2 are freed. Now a device is connected to fake port 4 with 3 configuration descriptors, the third containing PowerPC shellcode, which contains an extra 14 bytes. After this is complete, a device is plugged into port 5, which contains the exact same product and vendor IDs as the official Sony Jig. The PS3 allocates memory for the challenge response to authenticate that this is a real jig. This is where a heap overflow exploit occurs. This occurs because the 64 bytes of memory allocation points to the next free memory space which was overwritten earlier. This means that the shellcode is sent to the PS3 and starts executing when the PS3 detects removal of a device. And the last step is to disconnect the devices in port 5, port 4 and port 1. From here, the shellcode will execute the payload that we loaded earlier from port 1. When the PS3 boots, it's important to note that the hypervisor or level 1 has not been compromised at all, but level 2 or game OS has been exploited. The payload remaps the Blu-ray partition to either the USB device or hard disk in order to allow pirate or game backups to run from either device. It also opens up some other features and allows for unsigned code to run. For a short while, no one really knew how the PS jailbreak worked, but it didn't take long before complete USB dumps were logged. PS Jailbreak charged an exorbitant amount for their device, but it was quickly reverse engineered and open sourced for free. You could easily replicate the same process with a Teensy or an Arduino, or even a Raspberry Pi, and after a few weeks there were 10 new PS Jailbreak clones announced, which all had the exact same feature. It also wasn't much longer after that the jailbreak device could also be set into factory service mode thanks to the Jig Master Key discovery. This meant that you could downgrade its firmware back to 3.41 or lower as necessary. In the end, Sony ultimately patched the issue after firmware 3.55, but it was too late. This was only the first, but a very important step in a targeted effort against the removal of other OS, and with the second and more crucial was the discovery of the PlayStation 3's private key, which opened up the door to a custom firmware and the possibility of bringing back other OS. The Sony PlayStation 4 launched in North America in November of 2013, and with it a new generation of video gaming. As with any new game console launch, questions arise about the security, and in some cases the systems are rushed to market with perhaps less testing than necessary, and exploit entry points can be determined. But in this modern day and age of cryptography, per console CPU keys, encryption, data execution prevention and more, means that exploits are becoming much more difficult to identify. Unlike the PlayStation 3 and the Sony consoles that came before it, this time Sony did its homework. The PlayStation 4 was a very secure piece of hardware. The days of soldering on an 11Y mod chip to glitch the data bus or spam reset the CPU are long gone. If there was an exploit to find, it would be in software, and most likely be at the user level security access. But even the most secure console has its weak points. After the Sony PlayStation 3 was so famously exploited with its jailbreak device, for the PlayStation 4, Sony would invest heavily in security, with the first year and a half of the console launch having no public announcements ever made regarding hacking. And many people believe that the Sony PlayStation 4 security has never been defeated. But that is not true. What you may not be aware of is, yes, the PlayStation 4 security has been defeated with a timeline of various exploits since 2015, which means that unsigned code execution is possible, and there is a homebrew community surrounding the PlayStation 4, albeit much smaller than, say, the Nintendo Switch. So, when we think about the Sony PlayStation 4, we don't immediately think that is a system that has been defeated from a security standpoint. But the reality is, there has been exploits on the Sony PlayStation 4 since about 2015 that have allowed the system to run unsigned code. The Sony PS4 was the first Sony console to support the x86 architecture. The single-chip custom AMD processor houses the CPU, which is an 8-core processor codenamed Jaguar, and the GPU, a custom AMD-based Radeon graphics engine running at 1.84 teraflops. The PS4 also consists of 8GB of GDDR5 RAM and either 500GB or 1TB of internal storage, depending on the model. The mid-generation refresh, the PlayStation 4 Pro, offered some hardware updates for more power, but the underlying architecture and operating system were the same, and this of course was for compatibility reasons. The PlayStation 4's operating system is known as Orbis and is based on FreeBSD, which is a Unix operating system. Much of the PS4's OS was developed with open source tools, and a quick glance at the license screen will walk you through all the pieces of open source software that was used to make up the Orbis OS. During the PS3 jailbreak era, it was possible to downgrade its firmware via use of booting the PS3 into factory service mode. The hardware was criticized for not using eFuse technology, which was used on the Xbox 360. When an update was pushed, a fuse would blow inside the processor. This meant that there was never any way to downgrade back to an exploitable version of a kernel. Interestingly enough, the Sony PS4 also does not use eFuses and utilizes revocation lists instead. During the early years of the PS4, motivation to jailbreak or exploit the system was always present. However, it was not anywhere near the levels of targeted attacks after Sony famously removed other OS from the PS3. But because the operating system Orbis is composed of many open source libraries, the first logical step would be to start there. The PS4 comes with a web browser, which is a part of the operating system. The engine, known as WebKit, is also used on browsers for other game systems, such as the PlayStation Vita, Nintendo 3DS, and Nintendo Wii U. WebKit would serve as the entry point for many exploits. It's open source and already has a history of known vulnerabilities. Perhaps some of them weren't patched on the PS4. The first public exploit was released by security researcher CTERT in 2015. Known as Bad IRET, this was a previously known kernel exploit that was discovered in Linux and FreeBSD, and when applied to a PS4 with firmware 1.76, the system was vulnerable. The exploit takes advantage of WebKit and its just-in-time execution to gain kernel access, resulting in system corruption and the ability to override a pointer and redirect the kernel. This was the first but an important step into running homebrew on the PlayStation 4, but it also required a low firmware model and it wasn't very well known. Sony would simply remove just-in-time from the web browser and ensure that for any game that needed to be played, you would need to be on the latest firmware revision, hence addressing the issue before it really became widespread. After the Bad IRET kernel exploit was discovered and then patched, more work was done to identify newer exploits. CTERT would also discover and release the DL-close vulnerability, yet another kernel exploit for firmware 1.76 that was a buffer overflow. This exploit was also patched, and CTERT would then soon announce his retirement from PS4 security research. However, By this time, there were many expert-level security researchers looking into exploiting the PlayStation 4, and because WebKit ran on other game consoles, discoveries were often found on other systems first, then ported to the PS4. This would go on for some time, with Sony quickly resolving them in firmware updates with a general improving system stability message. By 2017, the PlayStation 4 was at firmware 4.55, and a significant kernel vulnerability would be discovered. FreeBSD implemented a virtual machine known as BPF, or Berkeley Packet Filter, which would provide a secure network layer and ensure reliable transmission of data packets and embed them in the kernel. A race condition situation can occur when two threads reference the same pointer. One thread would free the pointer while the other attempts to execute it post-free, and this allows a user to obtain an out-of-bounds write, which can then lead to code execution in Supervisor or Ring O mode. Sony patched this exploit in firmware 4.70, but they only patched the write functionality and not the core problem itself, which remained. Security researcher SpectreDev wrote a similar exploit for firmware 5.05, which would be well known as the 505 PS4 exploit. By this point, the PS4 homebrew scene was gaining momentum, and homebrew developers would soon work on emulators, tools, and applications for a jailbroken PS4. And if you were lucky enough to run a 5.05 firmware PS4, you can simply use what's known as a HEN, or homebrew enabler, that uses Sony's web browser as the entry point to trigger the BCF exploit and allow for unsigned code to run. 5.05 would be the last known exploitable PS4 for a few years, and this is partly the reason why the PS4 homebrew scene was quite small in comparison to others. As time progressed, finding an exploitable PS4 running 505 would be very scarce, and many believed that the PS4 homebrew scene was done. But in March of 2020, Andrew Nguyen, also known as The Flow, well-known security researcher who was instrumental in defeating security on the PlayStation Vita, announced that he was looking at security on the PlayStation 4 and advised users to stay on firmware 6.72 or lower if possible. And on July 6, The Flow then submitted his new exploit to PlayStation, who are offering a bounty reward. His kernel exploit would allow for the hijacking of kernel read-write primitives and code execution, and once again would use the WebKit as the entry point. Although a proof of concept, it was soon made available on the PS4. This meant that trying to track down a 6.72 firmware PlayStation 4 would be much easier. Due to the nature of the exploit, Sony had patched it before it was made public, but it does open up many more users who were interested in homebrew on the PS4. So what can you actually do with a modified Sony PlayStation 4? Well, let's take a quick look and show you some of the cool things that it's capable of doing. So to address the elephant in the room, yes, it's absolutely possible to play pirated games on a modded PS4, and I'm not going to dance around the issue. It's one of the reasons why people own a modded system in the first place. And with 6.72 means a much larger library of games that can be played on the system without requiring a system update. But my motivation is homebrew, and there are some really cool things that you can do with the PS4, and with the power of the console, makes it a great emulation box. First of all, you can enjoy many PS2 games on the system with the emulator that was developed for PS2 classics. It's nowhere near perfect, and the compatibility list is a bit hit and miss, but you can indeed play PS1 and PS2 games on your PS4. There is also a Linux distribution, which is great. Normally, Linux is not something that I'm really interested in, but this one is a little different. As you can see, it handles emulation quite well. It also comes with a Steam client, which allows you to log in and play from your Steam library. Not all games are compatible, the ones that require DirectX for example, but anything that requires Vulkan or OpenGL should run, and in most instances, it runs quite well. You can also turn your PS4 into a Kodi media center. But if you don't like Linux, there are still many great Orbis native applications as well, and overall it's a very interesting system to dive into. But unfortunately, the community just doesn't seem to be there. The small but dedicated group of individuals are working on PS4 homebrew, but sadly the main reason for a system seems to be for pirated games. But still, 6.72 hopefully won't be the last PS4 exploit that comes out. It is interesting, however, because as we know, Sony likes to issue firmware updates long after the hardware's end of life. But in conclusion, thanks to the hard work and dedication that security researchers put into the PlayStation 4, its security has indeed been defeated. But this time around, Sony has always been one step ahead rather than the other way around. Many people aren't even aware that there's even a homebrew scene on the PlayStation 4. What there is, however, is quite impressive, and hopefully we will see things continue as we move into the next generation with the PS5.